Hello, listeners. This episode of the Wonderful and Strange Twin Peaks Logcast is going to be a bit different than our usual fare. We thought it'd be best fit to have a content warning right off the get-go because this is going to deal with some heavy, serious subject matter. If you are listening and you are not really in a good mental space to be listening to a podcast about a topic such as abuse of children, including sexual abuse, drug use and addiction, or trauma and mental health, we would strongly advise you to avoid this episode of the podcast as we will be talking about those sort of subjects. Sometimes in order to keep this podcast up on the air, we might avoid using certain words that might get flagged, such as the RAPE word. Even though we will be talking about that, we may not use that language. We might from time to time still have some usual joking banter, but as a whole, this episode will be more serious because of the subject matter that the Diary of Laura Palmer deals with.
Yes, we want to make sure that the severity is known, even though we may not use more of the severe language, especially for the platforms that we do have. Now, if you are coming into this episode and do not think you can handle it, that's fine. Just so you know, the next episode we are planning is for Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. So if you want to catch up on that media in the meantime, just so you know, that's where we're heading next.
And one last final note. Because the professor and I are two male podcasters, we wanted to make sure that we brought a female perspective into this particular episode, given the Diary of Laura Palmer is about the experiences of a teenage girl, and neither myself nor the professor can relate to those experiences directly. As a result of that, we'll be featuring on this episode a friend of ours who will contribute some guest perspectives on the diary. Thank you very much for your understanding, and if you're joining us for this episode, I hope you enjoy, as always. If you have any questions, comments, or just remarks to us, you can reach us at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com or tweet at us at snakeeyedreams1. As always, that is the numeral 1. Thank you.
And on with the show.
I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello, and welcome to the Wonderful and Strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the pen to my diary.
I don't want any sort of hand in that. No, I'm good not being the pen.
But it's my diary, it's my life.
If it has anything to do with something like this, in this sort of context, in this sort of phrasing, I'm sorry, Kalil. I have to leave the podcast.
Well, what do you see yourself as?
I see myself as someone who has read something very personal.
We are talking today about The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, written by Jennifer Lynch, as many of you know, David Lynch's daughter. She was 22 years old when she wrote this. And as you said, it does read as something very, very personal.
Oh, yeah. Though I am very impressed. Jennifer Lynch, being 22 years old, has made something to this length, and honestly, I would call impactful from my personal reading. I haven't read anything really much like it.
Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily know if Jennifer Lynch has done a lot of fiction writing outside of this, or before this. So I think as a footnote on her career, it's a rather interesting way to start her literary endeavors.
Yeah, especially since it's been working with, like, David Lynch and Mark Frost, I imagine, or with a project of theirs.
They might have got her started a little bit on it. So before we get talking about our thoughts proper, I did want to give some context on the book itself. So The Diary of Laura Palmer was originally published in 1990. It was released between seasons 1 and season 2, in that time where it wasn't quite airing yet. So someone could pick up this book and get to this before we even have what happened to Cooper getting shot. So pretty early on, I would think, to have all this dumped on you. In 1990, she did an interview on Good Morning America that I checked out, and in that interview, Jennifer Lynch shared that prior to writing, she had been pulled into a dark room and told who the killer was before she began writing. Mm-hmm. The interview came out the day after the 1990 Emmy Awards, and just kind of some trivia out there. This was the award ceremony where season 1 of Twin Peaks had been nominated for 14 awards and had won 2.
Oh, no, honestly, that's great. I see things that just get the blatant end of of being nominated, so
I know that the interviewer didn't see it that way because he referred to it being a dark day for Twin Peaks fans and was very down in the dumps about only winning the 2 of the awards. By the way, the 2 awards were outstanding costume design and outstanding editing for a series with a single camera production.
Excellent. Now, mind you, I'm just wondering what sort of costumes really stood out.
This was pre-Tojimura, so it couldn't have been that.
I'm pretty sure they would have lost the reward if it was post-Tojimura.
Well, on that note, season 2 would be nominated for 4 Emmys and would win 0.
All right. Well,
quite a decrease.
I still think the fact of being nominated is an important statute, something that should be recognized. And besides, there's things that can be, let's call it, fixed in certain favors, depending on how well one advertised themselves with different things like parties or investments with the judges. But that's just the history of award shows in general.
I don't put much stock into it myself. I think it's interesting to look at what's being considered, but at the end of the day, the Academy doesn't necessarily have the fortune-telling abilities to know what's going to have staying power and what's going to deeply personally affect people.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, Twin Peaks didn't win many of those awards, but is remembered strongly by a fan base when a lot of other shows in 1990, quite frankly, aren't remembered 20, 30 years later. Back to the book. David Lynch and Mark Frost told Jennifer Lynch to, quote, be Laura Palmer. And Jennifer Lynch says that she knew Laura so well it was kind of like automatic writing. The book ended up reaching number 4 on the New York Times paperback fiction bestseller list, although some U.S. booksellers refused to stock it due to its graphic content.
Yeah, I can see why.
And I would assume it's not just the U.S. that had that issue.
I disagree with the sentiment, but I can see why.
Yeah. The independent booksellers who don't want their business being boycotted or getting any legal trouble, potentially, I can see why.
Is there a history of this being boycotted or anything like that?
Not that I could find. I don't know if it was a big enough item to receive wide attention for that reason.
Yeah.
But it was something that a lot of booksellers, I would imagine, wouldn't want to touch. And it may not have been enough of an earner for them to make it worth having on their shelf.
Okay.
At the time of release, Entertainment Weekly referred to the book as, quote, gratifyingly faithful to the spirit of Twin Peaks.
Okay. The spirit being...
the kind of the ethos of the show.
Okay.
They would say. And this book remained a pretty consistent element in the Twin Peaks fandom. I can't speak it for someone who was around when Twin Peaks aired, because obviously I'm not of that age. I wasn't around for that time. But it seems to have been a popular book. Like Fire Walk With Me, I'm sure it had its fans and its detractors that over time have come to maybe accept it a bit more than they had before.
Yeah.
It is probably as close to canon as you can get with a book for Twin Peaks, because it was given a foreword back in 2011 by Mark Frost and David Lynch. So I think that the presence of the foreword and so many elements in the diary showing up in some form in either the main series or possibly Fire Walk With Me or The Return, I won't spoil anything, but enough things correlate that I think there's an argument that this is quote-unquote canon.
Yeah.
To whatever you personally decide that means for you, Professor.
Well, in truth, it does cover the spirit of the show because, hey, Laura Palmer just keeps popping up like a ghost. But beyond that, one thing that I would like to especially note, I got my book off of Amazon and I desperately wanted that sweet, sweet hardcover. So mine seems to be an older issue.
Right.
Yours has the foreword.
Yes.
So we do have context for both ends. Mine's just older, has some creased edges, but overall is a very appealing looking hardbook cover.
And the creased nature of it almost appeals more. It looks like a damaged book slightly, and that fits to the contents.
That absolutely fits the contents.
I don't think this is a book that you keep like in its ceiling perfectly ornate. I think this is a book that when you show some wear and tear on it, that feels thematically fitting.
You hear that, bookseller? You've got to mess with this book so it is absolutely torn to reflect the general nature of this book. So get on it. Like, throw it into a small corner and let time do it.
Well, as time went on, we did get a 2017 re-release, this time with an audiobook that both you and I enjoyed alongside our paperback and hardcover copies.
Yeah, no, it was very, very fascinating. Genuinely, we get an actual voice from it from, hey, the actress who played Laura Palmer.
Cheryl Lee.
And she does a fantastic job, in my personal opinion, on presenting the general emotion of Laura Palmer, as well as just generally reading a book. She knows how to catch a reader's attention, though at times non-conventional her readings may be.
If you are interested in checking out the diary, or it's been a long time since you've read it, we would both strongly recommend the audiobook version. I did mine on CD because apparently I'm still living in the early 2000s, and the professor used Audible, correct?
Yes, correct.
Not sponsored.
Not sponsored at all. But
although Audible, and we're listening
all
here.
I'm saying is that you get a free credit when you use try out for their trial, at least at the time of this recording. So, hey, if you want to try it out.
And this audiobook re-release would coordinate in 2017 in May, right before The Return came out. Very timely.
Yes.
The publisher of this book also described this re-release, quote, as required listening for diehard fans of the original show and essential background for the 2017 revival. So those of you listening who have seen The Return, you can kind of evaluate in your minds what elements of this book, if you've read the book and seen The Return, what elements would you say are the essential background? For the Professor, you gotta wait a long time, bud.
Hey, it's essential enough for me to reflect on the past, as well as something for me to connect and look forward to with Fire Walk With Me coming up. So hey, I'll get to The Return eventually.
This is true.
Less as long as like the general audience, though. So unless this podcast goes on for 20 years in between to get that genuine feeling.
Yeah, you'll have an abridged version of that, right? In dog years. But yes. So in the meantime, I want to get some general thoughts across from you, first-time reader, and then me. I haven't read it in quite a few years. This was very interesting for me to go back to.
Yes.
Let's go ahead and talk just in general about the book, and then we'll dive into more of the specifics as we go through.
Looking forward to it.
So first up, the writing style of it.
Yes.
So like I said, as far as I can tell, Jennifer Lynch hasn't had a very huge history in fiction. And in terms of Twin Peaks fiction, there's this, and there's a few other books we have in our possession written by different authors.
Yes.
This is written in that diary format, right? And it's written from the perspective of like, I think it's 12 to like 16. We get kind of that range of Laura Palmer throughout this book.
Correct.
What do you think of the writing style of the diary itself?
Now, when it starts out, Laura Palmer is incredibly eloquent, and it
For a
kind of
12-year-old.
It takes me a little bit out, just kind of like thinking about it. It almost makes me wish that they kind of just asked around and say, hey, you got a 12-year-old around, keeps a diary, why don't we read that? And almost try to mimic that sense.
He just starts stealing the diaries of all the staff workers' 12-year-old daughters. Oh
like,
my gosh.
It's an immoral way to make this book, I know, but at the same time.
It's an immoral book. I fair enough. And that actually, you bring up a good point, though. And also I've heard some criticism of Cheryl Lee's narration that she doesn't really sound like a 12-year-old. So there's a bit of a jarring disconnect.
True, but she is also not a 12-year-old.
Right. I think there's an argument to be made that the voice that Cheryl Lee uses, you can kind of understand it when she's 16, but when she's 12, there is that disconnect.
I say that it's effective because it's a little bit of a reflection, almost as if like someone is reliving through the emotions. I'm fine with that. What I think happened here is that they wanted some consistency, possibly maybe the editors, possibly maybe Jennifer Lynch herself, to continue throughout the book, and I do think that that is a fault in the book.
If we take it as canon, that would mean that 12-year-old Laura Palmer and 16-year-old Laura Palmer were rather equally eloquent, to the extent that this 12-year-old was exceptionally capable as a writer and her word choice.
And I'm not saying those people don't exist, but when it's too consistent throughout the book, I do think that that is not exactly something that really connects to me as a reader.
I mean, Laura could be equal parts gifted and equal parts damned.
Yeah.
What else about the writing style did you notice, aside from just the age differentiation?
It is something that does definitely come out as personal throughout the book. I think that this is probably the most uncomfortable thing I personally have ever read. And I think that that is a pro, to say the least. I think that finding something that does explore other emotions, such as this amount of discomfort and amount of looking into someone's personal life, is definitely something that can be impactful for a reader, and it definitely didn't impact me in that way. I felt that I should have like stopped listening. In fact, I tried to listen on the way to work, and unfortunately, I did decide, nope, can't do that. Gonna listen at it at home. Nope, I can't. I cannot mix these two things.
Sure. That's understandable.
I felt filthy listening.
Well, and
to
I tried to warn you a little bit about that going in, but until you really dive in, you don't know the extent of that.
Yeah, we'll even like slightly feel it. At the moment, you can trust someone, but it's different when just reading it. Even like speaking to it now, if you haven't read it yet, or if you haven't gotten that Audible copy, trust me, it's going to feel different than how we speak of it.
Yes, because she does target that raw personal side of the writing so well. Because it's in journal format, there's also this tendency in real-world journals that I think the diary does a good job imitating in this book, is that when you're writing a journal, you oftentimes will repeat similar ideas that have been weighing on you for months at end.
Yeah.
So the diary does sometimes tread on the same topics over and over again. You're going to hear a lot about her anxieties. You're going to hear a lot about the same people in her life over and over again. But I also think that adds an element of realism that if someone was writing a diary and they're in Laura Palmer's position, they're going to be fixated on the same topics for years because those topics keep popping up.
Yes.
And I think that there are some things when you read the diary, you're going to be surprised how much they talk about, like, she writes about this one thing and how little she writes about something else. And that, again, makes sense to me that because she's writing about the things as Laura that Laura would be fixated on at the time. And I think that was done very well.
Excellent.
And going on that note, what did you think as someone who didn't really know much about Laura going in? And this is a heavy question.
Yes.
A loaded question. What did you think about what it reveals about Laura Palmer?
I think that's, for one, I could still interpret her as an Eldritch Horror, but more so as a person that I would pity overall.
Because if you're just tuning in right now and you haven't caught our earlier episodes, one, how dare you? It's understandable.
Yeah, no, we
this episode's designed to jump in just on this one if you want.
Yeah.
But early on in the show, when the professor hadn't seen any of Twin Peaks, he speculated that Laura Palmer might have some sort of Lovecraftian horror element to her.
Yeah.
He, literally, the pilot episode, you accused her of being a cult leader.
Hey. She has an influence to her, and unfortunately it was from something dark and twisted that eventually made her into who she is.
So you detected a sort of darkness and presence about her that you didn't really know what it was going to turn into.
Yeah.
But by the time we hear her gray-eyed doppelganger screaming in the red room, and now we have all this darkness of Bob going through her in the diary, I think there's some element of that darkness you had hinted at and suspected now being actualized in some tangible form, just again in a very different way than you might have thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is something that really makes a sad tale for Laura Palmer in general, something where I can look back and, though still be horrified in some actions that she had caused, there's not really as much blame on her as is the dark nature of what she has to face, whatever Bob may be.
I don't really know if you had any expectations going into this as far as what you expected or hoped to learn about Laura Palmer, but as a concentrated, 200 pages of Laura Palmer content, how effective do you think it was at conveying Laura Palmer's life and personality to you, having, again, gone into this not really knowing much of anything about her other than what James and Donna might have mentioned?
Very. It was very impactful. I think that with the context of the book going back in, it definitely does paint a more, I wouldn't even necessarily positive, but more saddening picture of Laura as we do see the funeral, as we do see the people that were impacted in general.
There's a lot of empathy in this book.
There's a lot.
I mean, it's literally written to be Laura's unfiltered thoughts.
Now, mind you, I do believe that these are her unfiltered thoughts. There will likely be some author bias, and there may be some points in interpretation where we have to ask whether or not we can believe her full cognitive position. But at the same time, I don't think that there's the secret third journal, if you will, Gravity Falls style, where there are the secret thoughts, the true thoughts. I think that this is going to be the most definitive thing we get from a lost person.
Fair enough. And then one more question I wanted to ask more again in general. How do you feel about the tone and contents of this diary as being canon as a Twin Peaks spinoff? Comparing this to the tone and feel of the TV show. What did you think of the diary?
The tone is absolutely different, but I think that's important for what it is, for what she has to face. Twin Peaks wasn't all about what's up with Bob, but this very much is. This is the family that she has been surrounded by, and this is her fending off what Bob is to her. This is this entity made to be a common thing through her day-to-day, and her struggles with it. Whatever it may fully be, but also with the struggles with some addiction, the struggles with control. It is, I find, important that the tone is this different, important that the tone was handled this way, and if people are able to read it, I do recommend reading this, though painful it may be, emotionally, not like how it is presented. I think it is presented in a good way, in a bad way. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It does make sense. Would you believe it, Professor, that I actually did some research for this episode?
Sure. Yes. We're going to go with sure. We'll do the kind.
So I looked at the Twin Peaks wiki, lovely as always. Looking dashing in its default shade of green.
Brilliant.
And there was a list of inconsistencies with the book that I thought I would bring to your attention and light.
Okay. I'm curious on how much, again, may be a writer's bias and how much may be enough for me to bend into reason.
Yes.
So let's find out.
So the original show takes place in 1989. But the book, based on the journaling of events, would lead you to believe that the events of Twin Peaks happened in 1990. There is a slight distortion because the book ends in the late 89, and then Laura Palmer dies, and then it would be 1990, which doesn't line up with what the show claimed as dates.
Well, clearly this is an inconsistency because time works weird in Twin Peaks. The past and the future are the same thing.
If you're willing to just argue time works weird and then not worry about that discrepancy, that is up to you.
Yeah.
Just something to throw out there.
Yeah.
One of the more glaring weird issues is that there are several names spelled differently in the book. You may not notice if you're relying more on the audio copy, but the actual physical copy of the book has some strange typos. So Madeline Ferguson, in the book, they changed the spelling so it is Line instead of Leine. So there's a missing E.
Now,
Ronette, they add an extra N in the book that isn't in the name Ronette. So it's just one N, then it goes to two.
Yeah.
Shelley, they add an E in the book when there isn't an E in otherwise. And then Emery Battis became Amory Battis. They actually spelled his first letter wrong in his name.
Interesting.
Wrong or different, depending on what you want to believe. And this is based on, again, the spelling we see either in the show or in the credits.
Yes.
And then Flesh World, this is a minor one. In the diary, it's listed as one word instead of two separated words. Now, you could wave off all of these as, Laura being a person who makes typos.
Yes.
Or writing errors.
Yes.
I do think it's interesting, though, that she would be consistently making these errors, and it's only seeming to be with names of people. It's not like there's other writing errors in the journal, is there?
I would argue that people names are the ones that I would misspell the most. In fact, I even have a stepfather. Love him to death. He's a fantastic person, and I enjoy his company so much. Problem is that I keep getting his name wrong. Even though, many Christmas cards have passed, I still question myself on that.
Yeah, I get it, but the diary doesn't have other typos. And that's what's so strange is that because you look more at the physical than I did. I mostly relied on the audio.
Yeah.
When you were combing through the physical, were there writing errors other than names really there?
Not that really comes to mind, but again, I'm willing to concede to the idea that names are fluid enough to get mixed up.
I just feel like it needs to go one way or the other. If we're going to allow typos and writing errors for the names, then I think we should see more words spelled wrong, and even things crossed out might even be good. Have a sense of this is a real genuine article, or have it fully edited.
You hear that, everyone? So from this point on, I'm going to look through all of Kalil's work, and if he gets anything else misspelled other than just names, I will call a falselyhood and say that he needs to work on getting himself an editor.
I don't think that's a fair comparison. My only point is that this is meant to be her diary.
Yes.
You either need to go the approach that it's going to be written the way she would write it, in which case a normal person writing a diary, especially in an emotional state, they're going to be spelling things wrong, and they're going to be having grammar errors. They're not even going to be writing full sentences half the time.
Yeah.
This is almost too clean, aside from the names.
Maybe that's where they tried to push the cleanliness, but at the same time, those who may be editing or focusing on it being a proper work may have wanted the general structures to still work, the general words to work. So yeah, I suppose I'm more okay with the dissonance in that respect. And hey, why not?
Yes. And then another inconsistency that's been noted is that it's unclear, the book versus the show, how long Donna had known Maddie.
Yeah.
Because in the book, we get encounters of Donna and Maddie at a fairly young age, early on, 12, 13, they knew each other. Whereas in the show, it almost seems like they're meeting for the first time. They don't seem to have a lot of familiarity. There's a little bit of a gap between how well does Donna know Maddie in the show versus the book. Is it reconcilable or not? I've heard some disagreement on that.
For me, I think that it's okay. When you haven't seen someone for years, you can be a completely different person, especially if we consider ages 12 and all the way into the high school years. I imagine Laura is more likely to be in contact with this person than Donna is. So I think that still is a passable fault.
Yes. And to clarify, I think these are all minor.
Yeah.
I do think these are all minor. I do think that with the typing errors, the writing errors, it could have been considered a bit more thoughtfully. It really does feel like the names were spelled wrong on accident. It wasn't consistent enough to be a notable thing. It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
But I almost wish if you're going to spell the name wrong, then spell other things wrong too. Whatever. It's still a minor issue. There are also two notable differences between the book and Fire Walk With Me, but they involve spoilers for Fire Walk With Me, so I won't get into them. Just know that there are two, and I'll probably remember to say them.
Probably.
You mentioned earlier that your copy did not have the 2011 foreword.
Nope.
So I lent you mine. I forwarded you my copy to read the foreword.
And I didn't let you touch mine.
I
Mine is
didn't want to
precious.
touch your disgusting copy.
Good.
Your greasy copy.
I made sure to lick it multiple times in case you did, so good.
So what did you think of the foreword?
Now, as far as the foreword goes, from one end, it's interesting to read Mark Frost's musings, which, by the way that he writes, it is delicious candy to my eyes. I look forward to going into The Secret of Twin Peaks, and I might pick up a few other of his books.
I feel like
on
eye candy
Audible.
is a different term than... Anyway, go on.
I'm going to pretend it's
You
the
think
way
Mark
that
Frost
I think
is
it
eye candy. That's all I
think
need
that
to know.
Mark Frost's words are eye candy, okay? I
sure.
don't want that misrepresented. His words are more beautiful. I am
Wow, are you
attracted
saying
to
he's
his
not?
words. I mean, they're more attractive to me than he is. I don't
That's
know the
fair.
guy. I
That's
know his
fair.
words more than him.
Yeah, there's a biography that came out about him like last year, I think it was.
Okay.
That you might enjoy.
Oh, fantastic. As long as it's words and not him. Anyway, it seems that there's a lot of respect that Mark Frost does pay forward in not only towards this work itself, but also it kind of goes into a little microcosm, a little bit of a snippet of the history with him and Lynch and how Twin Peaks even got started, and which I think is nice, though certainly strange when we're focusing more on Jennifer Lynch's book.
Yeah.
Where Pi was certainly involved in a nice little coffee house. Isn't that great? And it makes me almost wonder if this fondness for Pi might be indicative of that moment.
I really found the foreword rather underwhelming as a foreword.
Really?
Because I feel like, and I will not claim to be an expert on how to write a good foreword, but for me, it's giving context for the reader of the book you're going to be reading.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's not about that. There's barely anything in there that relates to Jennifer Lynch or the diary itself. It's more about Lynch and Frost complaining. Well, mostly Frost, actually.
Yeah.
Frost complaining about the dream and how it was handled by the corporations. And it feels like a soapbox that he wanted to just complain about Twin Peaks, not actually talking about the book written by Jennifer Lynch.
I think that it's still important in the respects that it shows that there is some regret held with Mark Frost. I think it's less of a soapbox and more so of a solemn chair in a cafe, just thinking and musing while you are drinking coffee and eating your pies, thinking, what if things were different? What if things had changed? And maybe even the context of this book and what they could sort of tell and deal with connecting to this book if they didn't push into this demand from the studio. I think that history is important. Now, mind you, I think there should have been more conversation, especially with David Lynch, too, talking about the daughter's book. But it still is something that I'm glad to have heard from the horse's mouth, if you will.
One area, I guess, where there is an intersection is that Mark Frost states that he now agrees with what David Lynch had said back when they were airing the show, that they made a mistake by giving into the network pressure to reveal the killer. Because, obviously, the Diary of Laura Palmer was released at a point before the killer was revealed, and it relates heavily to Laura's experiences with that killer.
Yeah.
So I can understand the sense of connection, then, that Mark Frost, when thinking about the Diary of Laura Palmer... Because, again, this foreword came out in 2011. It came out years later.
Yeah.
In between the original and the return.
Which I think that this forward is also important going into the return because I think that's the audience they were trying to hit.
Yes. So you get this sense that Mark Frost, we don't know when he came to this conclusion, but he eventually agreed with Lynch that, all right, we revealed the killer at the wrong time. Now, interestingly, the way I've always heard it with Lynch is he, never wanted to reveal the killer, basically.
Yeah.
Mark Frost words it a little bit more like we revealed it too soon. So I don't get the sense from this foreword that Frost was saying we never should have. He's like, I agree with Lynch that it was too soon.
Yeah.
I feel like there's still an element of disagreement between the two over whether the killer should have ever been revealed.
Too soon from never is still too soon.
Now, my question is, of course, we'll never know what could have happened in any other universe.
Yeah.
Do you think that they shouldn't have revealed the killer so soon?
I think that I'm fine with it for where it did lead. Again, I think I made this clear in our...
Episode 16, I believe it was.
It may have been episode 16. It may have been just like our bonus episode on my impressions.
Episode.
But it was my idea that I'm fine for the train ride no matter what sort of ways it takes. In this case, we missed a stop along the way on the train where we could have explored something or something would have changed, or perhaps Laura Palmer as a guest on this train would have been on for longer rather than going off on that stop. Yeah,
I have said something similar, and I'll say it again now. I don't agree with Mark Mark, not a first name basis. I don't agree with Mark Frost or David Lynch in the extent that I don't think the issue was when they revealed the killer. I think that was actually a really good point to reveal the killer. And I actually think the revealing of the killer is one of the best episodes in the entire series. I love the episode where that's revealed. And then the whole Maddie death sequence is one of the most harrowing elements of like daytime, well, not really daytime, primetime cable TV probably ever aired. But it's amazing that even got on the air the way it did.
Yeah, but the cleanup of it, what I would refer to as the cleanup, was definitely wild.
It's the episode where it's revealed and Maddie dies, and the episode after. Those are both incredible episodes. It's that episode where Leland is incarcerated and Leland dies that a lot of fans, I think, like better than we do. That was notoriously our least favorite episode of the series. And it's after that fact, we're not even sure in Twin Peaks how much the average person knows about Leland being the killer. It's never really clear. We don't get a lot of moments of people coming to terms with the fact that Leland killed his own daughter. It's unclear. Does Donna know? Does James know? They don't really talk about it. We don't see Ronette. We don't see Sarah Palmer. It's like the whole thing got swept under the rug. That's not a problem of when the killer was revealed. It's, again, like you said, it's the cleanup.
And I think just because, I've been looking and dabbling into Welcome Twin Peaks, something we'll cover in the future a little bit more, but it looks like that the entry for him saying that he will be missed, I don't think that they would do that for someone who may have been a notable act of murder, or at least in the general consciousness of it. So I think that for many people, at least, it wasn't quite revealed.
Well, that's the thing, though, is if it wasn't revealed, why did no one stop asking who killed Laura Palmer? Because that was like the central mystery of so many characters that were actively wondering that. But as soon as we got revealed the killer, it's as though everyone just stopped asking, which did Sheriff Truman get on the horn and say, "It's all right, everyone. We know who the killer is. You don't have to worry. They're gone now. Also, Leland's dead. Unrelated." Like, I don't know if that was clear. And the fact that we still don't know, I think the show didn't communicate that. So moving forward.
Moving forward in the forward, I do have to say with Mark Frost's entry, it's very nice to give that insight of Twin Peaks. After all, it's noted that Twin Peaks feels like a dream, that it was with two friends over 20 years with the assistance of 200 talented people, different artists. He
credits all the other people involved too.
And the most admirable thing, in my perspective, is that Mark Frost states that this is 9 hours of content that was filmed in a course of 18 months, and he considers it to be amateur.
Season 1, yes.
For season 1. And honestly, if this is considered amateur, if that portion was considered amateur, I'm impressed by the amateur production.
There's a sort of fly by the seat of your pants nature that the season 1 had, that they hadn't known the reaction to it yet. They just filmed it before it actually got aired.
Yeah.
And they didn't know what it was. After the fact, you can refer to it as lightning in a bottle. But if you've ever been in one of those creative periods where you're just going with whatever flows, right, and everything's just clicking into place, it wasn't something made by two people who had decades of film experience. It wasn't something where people were giving them a lot of advice and direction. They were just making stuff
They were making stuff, and it seems that they had a really genuine connection as far as like how they both talk to each other. He compares himself to Ike and Mike, which I assume is the candy. I don't know if the candy is based off of anything else.
Dwight Eisenhower.
Dwight Eisenhower, known as both Ike and Mike, a fusion of a man.
And it's interesting. Noticeably, he doesn't mention season 2. He just sticks to season 1, just the first 9 hours.
I think that question of what he kind of wish he could look into kind of would be a little bit downplayed if he went too far into season 2, but I would love to see his thoughts on it. Regardless, we are left with the 3 testaments that he would try to keep to.
Yes.
And that is to trust instincts, fight for what they believe in, and don't let other people's fears become theirs, which kind of did with the whole entire killer reveal.
Arguably so, yeah.
I mean, he argued
the only part that really relates to the actual Diary of Laura Palmer comes fairly toward the end, I think. Maybe it's like the halfway point. He makes this comment that, quote, "For anyone who's ever sampled or obsessed over the show, here's another bright pane in its hall of mirrors." I like that wording. I like that sentiment. I wish that he hadn't spent 80% of his time for this foreword talking about things he did years ago that did not involve Jennifer Lynch. I don't know. I just feel like it's taking away from Jennifer Lynch's work. There's this book I've been meaning to get to sometime in the future called Laura's Ghost, Women Speak About Twin Peaks. And I know that Cheryl Lee had some involvement in that book as well. And it's a series of interviews and essays on the subject of Laura Palmer and in general, the relationship between the show and female characters. That feels like a much more prescient idea for a foreword.
Yeah.
Obviously not the whole book in front of the diary, but I mean something actually talking about Laura Palmer or women's issues or Jennifer Lynch.
Yeah.
So when I see Mark Frost and David Lynch come on here and be like, good job, Jennifer. Also, by the way, we hate CBS. Like, I don't know.
Which, by the way,
it's a bad taste in my mouth.
We have to, like, talk about David Lynch's entry as well. If
The
we're gonna
short
talk
and sweet little David Lynch entry.
Mark Frost is about 3 pages, like maybe 2 and 3/4. And
pretty
meanwhile,
short
David
by
Lynch,
forward standards, but David Lynch, though.
3/4.
Yeah, he wasn't even going to bother with that.
And I think the most hilarious thing to me, likely unintentional, I'm sure that he loves his daughter. I'm sure that he loves his daughter's work. I'm sure that he does well as a father.
There's some stories about that.
I hope he does well as a father.
He's a very distant man. He is someone who consistently prioritizes his art more than anything else, and that would include his family.
But it is noted that he thanks Jennifer Lynch. He thanks the audience for Twin Peaks, but most of all, he thanks Mark Frost.
Yes.
And it looks like he's putting Mark Frost on that pedestal while we're highlighting Jennifer Lynch's work.
Which, again, I just feel like that's not necessary.
It's not necessary.
It's not the time or place. Like, good that you're giving props to Mark Frost. Like, great.
It definitely shows their bond.
But
But
it's not the place.
this is not the place or time, my friend.
When he's talking about the book, he describes it as, quote, Laura Palmer was born in this dream, and so was her diary. Jennifer Lynch found the secret diary of Laura Palmer in the heart and mind of Laura herself. And he kind of speaks about the whole creative process of the original Twin Peaks as being like riding on a dark wind, a dark night wind. It's just kind of marveling at everything around you. And he seems to imply through his shortened foreword, Jennifer Lynch is really no more responsible for the diary itself than he and Frost were for the original Twin Peaks. And that he kind of compares both as just tapping into an idea or energy that they just happen to connect to. Like, it's almost less Jennifer Lynch writing this than Laura Palmer speaking through Jennifer Lynch like a host.
I think that the way that David Lynch words it and gives praises, I think it still is high praise.
No,
I think
you have to be someone who can conduct that current.
And so that's why, for me, whenever I partake on media, I usually choose whichever feels most canon towards what I see in a story. And I think that this amount of credence to it, as well as how it does communicate emotionally on those levels, yeah, I think that this is a good read through a Laura Palmer lens. And David Lynch may agree to that.
I think at this point we've done a fine job giving context for the book.
Oh, you vain jerk. I think we did a horrible job. There we go. I'm humble.
We have no idea how long this episode's going to be.
Nope.
And just for some full transparency, this is the longest set of notes I've ever had for a podcast. I don't know how this is going to compare to the movies. I think when I get to something like Inland Empire, it's going to be a nightmare and a half. We'll see.
I can't wait until we have our 9-hour podcast.
But the thing is, I have double the pages I normally have on here.
Yes.
And if you've read the book, you know the nature of how things come and go constantly. Structurally speaking, we're going to roll with this the best we can, but we're going to be touching on things all over the place. So in no particular order here, kind of. First thing we have is Maddie. Are we ready to dive into Maddie?
Of course, because this one is the true Maddie.
Let's go to Missoula, Montana, Professor.
Oh, boy.
So my first topic here is the existence of Maddie.
Yeah, she exists. I never contested that. She
No,
exists.
but you question the way she exists.
The way that she exists, yeah, I believe that she was an entity, but I think that Laura Palmer, especially with how much high praises that she does give Maddie inside this tome, I do believe that there could be enough that, hey, if someone
really
had to wear a Maddie mask, hey.
When you were first watching the show, it almost felt to me at times, although again, I couldn't really say spoilers, it almost felt like you were accusing Maddie of being a doppelganger, but you didn't have the context of that yet. Because you were talking about it being like another Laura, and I'm just over here thinking of there literally being the doppelgangers in the Red Room.
How's Maddie?
So at this point, we have more context for Maddie in the diary.
Yeah.
She's not a recurring character. Like you said, it's someone that they knew when they were young, and then she kind of makes a small phone call appearance later, but she's not a constant presence in Laura's life or Donna's life.
Yeah.
We know at the beginning that Maddie is 16 when Laura is 12.
Yeah.
So if there is an element of doppelganger or parallelism, there is an age difference, at least on the birth certificates.
I understand that. And the thing that does bother me, there's two things that bother me with that. One is that conversation with Sarah Palmer with Maddie, in which Sarah Palmer is just making emphasis on, hey, do you know how this person's doing? Your mother. Oh, And it's just very passive, and it just almost backhands that subject away. That's suspicious to me because, hey, who wouldn't have that knowledge?
I don't think her mind was in the right place for that.
Possibly. I'm reading. It could be a little bit of both. Again,
we know Maddie could see Bob in the household just like Sarah Palmer could.
Yes. There's also column B, where I'm thinking to myself that Maddie is saying, do not trust my cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how far I take that. Is it possible that, hey, a doppelganger could die and Laura Palmer could die? That both of them could potentially be dead? I don't know. That scene opened up so many doors, and this...
And knowing that got kept in the last episode while other things got cut, it was important enough that they needed to keep it for some reason. Whereas Josie got cut.
Yeah.
That's, again, curious. As far as the diary goes, we do get more of a connection to Laura then, that Laura knows Maddie similarly has the bad dreams that Laura has. We don't know if Maddie has dreams about Bob. It would be interesting if Maddie did, because Maddie's not around Leland.
I would argue that it seems that Sarah Palmer's side of the family, at least, or whichever way Maddie's connected to the family, definitely has some, I would say, still a psychic or seer-like link to the supernatural.
And it's interesting because some of that is due to Leland literally being the manifestation of Bob. If they live in a household with Leland, it doesn't surprise me that Sarah and Laura both see Bob. But Maddie doesn't live with them.
No.
So if she's having weird supernatural dreams in another state, that would imply something a bit different than Bob, per se.
Yeah, I think that what kind of tipped me off, I didn't think that was impacted by Bob directly, was A, Sarah Palmer seeing the white horse in the living room, and B, how she was directly speaking for what I would imagine the Black Lodge.
Yeah.
So
in the last episode, you're referring to at the Major.
Correct.
Yeah. And there's a point later on where Laura sends out a mental prayer, sort of a wish, out to Maddie. It reminds me a bit of the moment where Audrey sent out a prayer to Cooper, right? And Cooper took his time getting to it. He got shot. Whereas Maddie got back shortly after and called Laura kind of out of the blue, which Laura interprets to mean that, yes, she got my mental prayer. Do you believe that was the case? Do you believe that Maddie heard Laura calling psychically in some way?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
I agree with you. I think that too.
I do think that there is a definite supernatural element between the women of the... Palmer and Ferguson households. I don't know what the traditional last name would be, especially if it is just the female side and where they're married into. I think that'd be a fascinating thing to explore.
We do have context, though, that Maddie is on Sarah's side of the family, right? I believe that's confirmed.
I think it is, but I'm mainly leaning on the conversation Sarah was having with Maddie.
I think Maddie's mom is Sarah's sister.
And not to mention, I think that with Laura Palmer looking up to Maddie so much, it definitely puts more into context on where they ended up. And that sense of distrust is, it's delicious.
Maddie's a real victim in the series. Obviously Laura is. Obviously there's a lot of victims. But Maddie's someone whose death is so extra because she just kind of showed up, got immediately wrapped up in James and Donna's nonsense, and then got murdered because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Donna almost got murdered, but not to say that Donna deserved to get murdered, but Donna's murder at least would have been the sense that she'd been digging where she shouldn't be, and Donna had been doing some things that I think if she got entangled in this, it would be partly her own doing.
Yeah.
Whereas Maddie just got dragged in. I really think Maddie's a victim in the purest sense that she didn't really do anything wrong here.
No.
She just got dragged into it. And there's that weird moment where they're trying to lure out Jacoby and she's wearing the Laura wig that you commented how cheap that wig looked.
It is a cheap wig.
And, again, if you think about Maddie as being almost like a doppelganger, it really does raise questions about that moment.
Or maybe that was actually Laura Palmer in a bad wig. Again, that is one of the things that I'm surprised I am so attached to. But, just some moments in the show.
Speaking of Donna, though, there's a lot in this book about Donna, and I think understandably so. I think it's a good thing that this diary gave us so much Donna content. And I think it shows us more of what we already suspected in the sense of there was that scene where, and I love the scene, it's my favorite Donna scene, I believe, where she's at the tombstone of Laura Palmer at night, and she makes this comment that it's like the town couldn't bury Laura deep enough, that all of Laura's problems are attaching to Donna. And I have my misgivings about Donna as a person. Yeah. For me, and I never really mentioned this, but I'll say it now, for me, Donna's character was ruined for me in the pilot, basically, because the moment I realized that Donna was the kind of person who the day her best friend died, she would make out with her best friend's boyfriend, that disgusts me. Like, I understand she's in an emotional state. She's gravitating towards someone for affection and condolences. I understand it. But it really feels like she cared way more about James and their relationship that happened on a moment than her best friend being dead. And it really just ruined the character morally for me.
Okay.
Donna could never dig herself out of that hole. For me, in my viewing, I always thought of Donna as one of the most just despicable people. And I do judge that.
Now, whenever it comes to this, especially on characters so young, whenever it comes to a character under 25, it's that old saying of I didn't know any better versus I should have known better. So when you are in a developing state,
Donna is one series of I should have known better decisions after another.
Yeah.
She never escapes that.
Congratulations, you found a teenager in a drama.
She's worse than the average teenager, though. I would say she's she's worse than James. I don't even want to get to that right now.
Regardless, I've seen all sorts of forms of mourning, not only just in my personal life, but also how people have kind of come to me over their personal life. And there have been moments of just push into their emotions, push into the more primal givings. And to say that an idea of fondness, an idea of wanting someone who they can be in that romantic way, hey, it's the most soap opera moment inside the show.
It's one of them,
I give it more credence to the genre we're playing up and almost playing around more than I do on the general character. So
right.
I'm more forgiving. Meanwhile, I'm still more iffy on the people who should have known better in the adult situation.
That's fair. I think the adults deserve more scrutiny than the kids. I would agree with you. I still think there's this sense with Donna that she, from the show, you could tell she didn't know much about Laura, at least the secrets that Laura had.
Yeah.
She suspected to some degree, but I almost wonder if Donna wasn't putting up some unconscious mental blockage that she didn't want to know the truth, so she didn't let herself know the truth. Because there is an alarming amount that Donna didn't really understand, and we see that coming through the diary big time.
And I'm kind of curious on her attachments generally to Laura Palmer, if it's a sense that being friends for so long might have just continued this more followed nature, this curious nature, just because there have been multiple times through the work that there has been some resistance, not complete, but some resistance that is kind of, I would say, almost easily steamrolled by Laura's ambition or Laura's drive.
Right. And I think that, like any realistic friendship, there were highs and lows and elements of each other that they liked and didn't like. And I think for Donna, it's really telling that she gravitated toward James after the fact, when James, which we'll get to in a moment here, was barely in the diary, and he's just kind of a little anecdote of this nice, pure thing that Laura almost saw as one of the last pure things she could get involved in.
Yeah.
The fact that Donna went for this naive, innocent, pure figure.
We can argue about pure.
We can argue about pure, but pure in the eyes of Laura, and I think pure in the eyes of Donna.
Yeah.
I think that the parts of Laura that Donna liked went away as the diary progressed, which explains their friendship also deteriorating.
That purity thing just kind of bothers me, just because this pure man is the same one who flipped out and freaked out and tossed things on the floor for the Palmer household when he doesn't get his way.
Yeah, well, hey.
He's the pure child.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say a temper tantrum is a pure emotion.
Sure.
It is, I didn't get what I want, wah.
It's the pure, I need therapy, and hopefully we can find something better than Jacoby.
We have Dr. Jacoby.
No, we don't want Dr. Jacoby.
So back on Donna. From an early age, we get this sense that Laura can't even really share her basic sad thoughts with Donna because, as Laura puts it, Donna doesn't realize that often the thoughts closest to my mind are the sad ones.
Yeah.
So even from a young age, like prior to age 12, Laura knew that she couldn't tell Donna all the sad things. This is even before the Bob elements. This is even before the really scary dreams.
Yeah.
She just couldn't trust Donna to get sadness.
Yeah. I'm almost curious, and maybe there was something inside the text that I may have overlooked since the time we recorded this podcast, but I'm just wondering if there might have been a fear with Laura almost wanting to not taint something that she may have found.
I think there's an element implied of that, yeah. Yeah, I think you can read a lot of the distancing that Laura has with Donna as a sense of preserving Donna. I think with a lot of Laura's actions, it's multiple layers going on. Some are healthy, some are unhealthy, some are quasi-healthy in the gray area. It's things that Laura's doing to protect herself and protect others, whether right or wrong in its guidance.
Yeah.
Laura also doesn't want to tell Donna about the bad dreams. She's worried she won't understand. She claims at one point that Donna knows the most about her and sometimes is good understanding, but other times Donna just giggles. The giggling, I think, is interesting. That not only does Donna not really understand, but there's this sense that Donna's response to not understanding is like an awkward giggle. She just doesn't really pick up on it yet.
And as someone who's experienced anxiety in the past, where having someone make a reaction that I wasn't expecting, it can create more reservation for the character, and I imagine that must have dissuaded her from opening up in general to expect something like a giggle or see that disconnect and not know where or who to connect with. Like, if Donna reacted differently, maybe we might have had different experiences with Laura Palmer if she had someone to work those things out with.
And a lot of these differences do stem from differences in how they handled their sexuality. So prior to puberty, they were very close friends. And it feels as though with the onset of puberty came the onset of Bob, the bad dreams, but also sexual awakening. And Donna, by no means, is necessarily quote-unquote a prude. There is the sense in which Donna has an interest in boys, but it's a very different interest than Laura has. And so when Donna's thinking about boys, she wants to be treated like a princess. She wants to go drive in their cars, go on dates. And when she does think about anything that involves sex, it's more of a peaceful, gentle, almost described like a soap opera, the way the diary describes it.
Hey, if they check out Utena, which would be premiering a few years later, hey, maybe they could have all of it. Princesses, driving around, sex.
Right. Referring to the anime we both enjoy.
Very much
made
so.
videos on.
If that interests you, like, if those are the only points I'm putting towards Utena, hey.
Revolutionary Girl Utena, especially the movie. The movie has a lot of cars. Anyway, returning to this. Laura, when she's put in that position, is kind of in an awkward spot because if Laura really says what she thinks about sex, it's gonna completely just like jarringly confuse Donna. And just possibly push Donna like leagues away. So instead, Laura has to lie and say like, oh yeah, I think the same things, Donna. It's okay. And there's moments where Laura even seems to be hoping, against all doubt, especially when she's like 13 or 14, hoping that Donna's going to say something that Laura has felt too. But Donna's so much, you can view it as behind in maturity. You can also view it as maybe Laura's accelerating in a different direction, but there's this sense that there's that disconnect between them where what Donna considers scandalous, Laura is considered normal 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, they're not even close in the same realm.
You could say one's from Venus and one is from Earth. Absolutely.
And I kind of speculate that although the book doesn't get into it as much as it maybe could have, I think Renault almost filled that border a little bit.
Yeah.
Renault became the female friend that Laura could divulge those fantasies to because Renault was living in the same world. And that makes me wonder, too, that if Donna had reciprocated, would Laura have pursued that physical connection with Donna the way she did Renault? I think it's quite possible because Laura seems to treat physical intimacy as a form of coping mechanism for belonging in a way that isn't necessarily exclusive to a romantic relationship.
I think that there's also a question on how much of a power dynamic it might be in which she feels that she has more control when she is chasing these emotions as opposed towards it seems that Donna gives off a more passive role. Again,
Yes.
that princely figure, having something in which she is being treated.
And Laura already has control over Donna without needing to do any of those sort of things.
Exactly.
There's a moment where they're trying their first cigarettes, and Donna is really hesitant. And Laura writes in the diary that, real friends, they don't pressure each other. But if she gives a certain look, a certain way, she knows she can get Donna to do it.
Yeah.
And that's when she's like 13. Like, Laura knows that she can get Donna on her side just with a little bit of a gesture, a little bit of the intonation of her voice. That's a lot of control for a 13-year-old to have over their best friend.
Yeah, and it seems that she gets her own personal, I would say, almost high off of it at times. There's something about having control, especially with what she's had to face in the past, with a lack of control,
right,
that is a drug on its own.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting also the sort of back and forth in Laura's relationship with Donna, where sometimes Laura seems to treat Donna with a little bit of derision. There's that sense where it's like Donna doesn't get it. Donna's confused about it, almost judging Donna's lack of understanding. Other times, though, Laura seems to envy Donna's innocence. She, a lot of times when going through her periods of guilt, Laura will say that she needs to be good, think no more bad thoughts, no more thinking about sex. And she keeps wording it as be more like Donna. So in her mind, Donna's almost the good angel on her shoulder.
Yes.
And she thinks that if I could just be more like Donna, my life would be simple, my life would be happy, I wouldn't have all these secrets.
Yes.
If I could just be like Donna. But she can't be.
No.
And no more than Donna can be like Laura. And she worries that if Donna knew how black her insides were, that friendship would go away.
Again, with that laugh, as well as appearing anxiety, I can't tell whether or not it would be, because obviously we didn't live through a reality like that. But it is definitely something very saddening for people, for something that could be very relatable for people. Where
The Haywards don't do good with secrets in their family.
Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. We've seen how Donna reacted when facing a difficult reality, with Benjamin Horne possibly revealing that he is the father, as opposed towards Doc Hayward. And it seemed that this had driven Donna into a little bit of a frenzy, saying, no, you're my daddy to Doc Hayward. I'm wondering if, especially a younger Donna, if she may have tried to turtle up on a previous reality and not believe the activities Laura could have been compelled with.
Yeah.
I'm curious on how she would have reacted if, like, the nightmare scenario would be true.
Well, the fact that when confronted with the situation, Donna's response is to, 1, run away, and 2, clutch Doc Hayward and say, you're my daddy. And it was very specific when I were doing our pod episode that she used the word daddy.
Yes.
She used a very childlike way of wording that.
Yes.
That, yeah, I honestly do wonder if Laura had been around longer, if Laura would have lived longer and Donna would have learned more of those secrets. I honestly wonder if Laura wouldn't have, as you were kind of mentioning it, almost turtle inward, right? That she would withdraw into herself and go into that sort of almost Freudian stages of development. She would regress into an earlier stage. There's a lot of elements of Donna that feel repressed in a different way than they are for, like, Laura. Laura, you can argue after reading the diary, how much had she really known about Leland? How much had she suspected about Bob that she pushed in the back of her subconscious? Yeah. There's an argument, because there's a moment where she realizes, and it makes you wonder how long had she kind of known but not let herself.
Yeah.
I think Donna, to some degree, has that repression too, but it has less tolerance. I think that Donna's repression will not let anything that violates her princess world almost.
Yeah.
And I think that ends up hurting Donna in the long run because she's not able to face those things head on. I think she wasn't able to face her feelings on Laura's death head on either, because she jumped right into James's arms right after. Just the way she jumped into her daddy's arms right after she encountered that problem.
Oh, boy.
Again, Freud.
Oh, again, Freud.
She's into the strong arms of the daddy figure.
Yep.
Oh, man, I didn't expect to do so much psychoanalysis this early. Sort of a microcosm of their whole relationship is the Josh and Tim situation, which we had first heard in the TV show from Donna's conversation with Harold.
Yeah.
She had shared to Harold this story, which, now that I'm thinking about it, Harold probably knew the story already from the diary.
Yeah.
So when he was listening to Donna's version, it wasn't new to him.
It may not be new to him, but
New
it's still a perspective. It could be validation on where what the truth fully was.
Sure.
I mean, that's what kind of like Harold is looking for, these true stories, these overall experiences fully of life, and knowing that there's a bit more to conclude that and make it true. I can see where he kind of may romanticize that encounter.
And I think that both Donna and Laura romanticize it in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
Laura's account is much more specific, and because it's from Laura's perspective, she, to use kind of an analogy here, she was closer to the edge of the waters than Donna was.
Yes.
In the sense that Laura was engaging in activity that'd be much more risque and scandalous than what Donna was. Now, the whole situation itself is deeply alarming and problematic.
Yeah.
Especially for the gentleman involved doing what I would consider a very, very bad thing by doing this.
Yes.
But the parts that Donna emphasizes and the parts that Donna is willing to engage in compared to Laura's, and also comparing what this situation represented to them, there are some differences that are worth note. In Laura's version, we find out how this all started, that Laura basically convinced Donna, as Laura was always the one that seemed to be in charge.
Yeah.
Laura convinced Donna to meet a couple of boys at the Bookhouse.
Now, mind you, this was also on a day that their parents were away so
Yes.
that they could get more away with it. At a party at Benjamin Horne's.
Yes.
So, and yeah, no, they decided that they were going to go off there. And I believe that Donna did even go into, they were wearing certain outfits.
Yes.
To here. By the way, we find out what the Bookhouse is.
Yay!
Yeah.
Finally some context.
So finally some context. If true, the Bookhouse, believe it or not, is a coffee house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, again, in a series so obsessed with coffee, it must not be that good of coffee. Like, compared to the Double R, it's not that good of coffee.
Hey, apparently there are some places to get really good cups of coffee that we can go deeper into as we talk more about Welcome to Twin Peaks. But hey, that's in the fun future. In this reality, it might be subpar coffee. It might be coffee on the side. This might be a bed and breakfast because there's literally a bed there that Truman stays in.
I do think it's really funny to think that the Bookhouse Boys don't even like the Bookhouse Boy coffee.
Yeah.
Like that they would go to the Double R for their coffee, even though they literally are the Bookhouse Boys.
It's closer. I imagine the Bookhouse is in the middle of the woods just from how the lighting is.
I do think it's interesting how much the diary de-glamorizes the Bookhouse Boys, and this is something I want to talk a little bit about. She describes the place as smelling like cigarettes, aftershave, coffee. This is it's a man cave, right? That's what this place is. And it's interesting then to think that the Bookhouse Boys, as we understand them, it's a bunch of high school football stars who unofficially do their Batmaning protecting the town from the vague idea of darkness in the woods. And yet, to Laura Palmer, who's experiencing more darkness than possibly anyone in Twin Peaks, she just goes there to hook up with guys.
I mean, it
isn't very helpful. Like, the Bookhouse Boys are not helping Laura Palmer.
No, at least this generation of Bookhouse Boys. I don't know on how Truman.
It just feels like a gentleman's club almost. They just like hang out with each other and do guy stuff.
Which apparently, women are allowed. Like, it's okay if like women do come to the Bookhouse. She does make note onto that.
But they're not Bookhouse Boys. They're not inclusive like that. It doesn't feel like they really do much for how much the talk is from Truman that they're supposed to be doing this sort of protecting. I know they're a bunch of high school buddies. That's all they are.
I'm
pretending they can do more.
Maybe that's where Truman sort of stands. Like, they're the true Bookhouse Boys, and they've got to somewhat guide these other people. Which, by the way, bad selection for the Canadian Bookhouse Boys who are stopping by.
We meet these two men named Josh and Tim. Also, we find out that Jake is some guy who runs the place.
Okay.
And there's this picture of a man on a wall that Laura is like drawn to.
I'm just going to imagine that Jake, since we didn't get a name for that one man who ended up getting knocked out at the Bookhouse trying to watch over Truman, I'll just imagine that's Jake.
I like to imagine it's young Toad.
Just young Toad?
It's Thaddeus himself.
Thaddeus,
in his prime.
Jake, Toad, so many initials in there. He has 100 names, I swear.
Laura describes Josh and Tim as men in their 20s, quote-unquote nice guys. Laura said she felt safe with them, but not excited. That is the realm that these two occupy to her. Yeah. They gave Laura and Donna marijuana, and it was their first time smoking it.
Yep.
There's a moment where Laura reflects in the diary that she doesn't think that they would have had sex with them even if they had asked. She detected that they were almost afraid to go that far.
Yeah.
So Laura speculates that even if she and Donna had initiated, the men would not have gone that far. However, they are willing to go farther than they should.
Yeah.
And this whole situation, I think it's interesting that Donna even romanticizes it even with Donna's quote-unquote purity in mind.
Yeah, even when she's talking about it with Harold, it still is in that fairy tale sense of
And even in,
how soft everything was.
Even in like late 80s, early 90s, this still would be eyebrow-raising that you don't let your like 15, 14, 13 even year old daughters in the situation.
This is very much in our modern day context an FBI open up situation.
Yeah. And deservedly so, because Josh and Tim, these random Canadian guys, just show up and thank God nothing worse happened.
Yeah.
But even what did happen, again, there's concerns.
Absolutely.
And from Laura's perspective, though, this is like a good memory to Laura. This is pretty much like no negatives. Laura writes about enjoying the feeling that these men in their 20s needed her. This sort of empowerment angle that she felt. She describes everything as feeling like a dream, like a form of bliss, to the point where she didn't even care if she ever saw Donna again, if she ever saw her mom again or Maddie. Everything in the night was just great. The only exception, of course, is that when she thinks of it later, she purposefully makes it nastier.
Yeah.
She thinks about it later and kind of thinks, well, what if it had gone farther? What if it had gone this way? So she purposefully changes the memory in her mind to distort it to make it more than what it was for her. And notably on that night, again, Donna did not go as far as Laura did.
Yes.
And toward the end of that exchange, there was a period where Laura and Donna embraced in a hug. And Laura thinks of this as being one of the most pure, and that was her wording, purest joys of that night.
Yes.
That in a night where there was drugs and sexual activity with the men, one of her highlights was still the hug with Donna, which I think is interesting to note. And there was a period shortly after that where Laura and Donna weren't speaking, and Laura felt like she had gone too far. She was being judged. And then later patched it up with Donna, and things returned to a relative sense of normal. But I don't really know if Laura ever got closure on that period where Donna never talked to her. It just feels like they fell out for a little bit, and then they started talking again. And that can happen.
I think it really does chip away at the statue that was their relationship, if anything. And that
the forbidden fruit.
Oh, no.
If you will.
No. There is like a lot of problems with their relationship, and it makes me quite sad.
Yeah. Hey, thankfully we have a relationship that has no problems at all. Enter Mike the Snake Nelson.
Yeah. What? I'm sorry.
I'm being sarcastic.
Thank you. I was about to walk away from the mic. Oh, that works two ways.
Oh no.
This is what you do to me.
There's a point later on where Donna pulls Laura into her room, and she tells Laura that she and Mike are going to go all the way on Thursday. And again, Laura has to pretend that that's a big deal. When at this point, Laura's had like a whole list of men that she's encountered with, and women.
Yep.
So this is nothing to Laura.
Nope.
And Laura, all she really has to note about it is she thought that Mike seemed like a jerk. She uses a stronger word than jerk. But she's like, whatever, I'm not sleeping with the guy. So she even has a sort of blasé, like whatever attitude toward it. Like, Donna's entering a relationship with one of the clearest jerks in the school, and Laura's just like, whatever. At least it's not me doing this.
Yeah.
Says a lot where Laura and Donna's friendship has gone, that there's no protectiveness anymore.
No, it is, I guess, that she's kind of like existing in Donna's life more than she is engaging in it.
I do think it's interesting to wonder what Donna saw in Mike. Because by the time the show begins, he's stereotypical controlling boyfriend.
I think that there were definitely moments like how he was with Nadine, where there is still an aspect of love. There was just some toxicity that was also in the background.
There's almost a maturity angle. She wants to be with a guy who's like slightly older, can drive these fancy cars.
Yeah.
He's a football guy. Like, I think there's this sense of it fits the mold of someone Donna would be interested in enough.
Yeah.
And she probably thinks, like Nadine, that his buns are cute. But as far as personalities meshing, I don't know how much connection there was or how much Donna even really thought about the personality element.
I mean, in Mike being in good standing with probably the rest of the school, he may have just been a knight in shining armor for a bit.
Well, and also thinking that Laura's with Bobby's friends with Mike, I think there might have been that element too.
Yeah.
That Donna has a little bit of that competitiveness with Laura that she kind of wants to keep up a little bit with
we
Laura.
see it inside the series where
Yeah.
like she tries to emulate some of Laura's habits and how Laura was.
So you can date a football star, I can date a football star.
They're both like even together. Like how could their personalities not be more similar?
And that's the thing is you realize how naive Donna was to even if that's what she thought.
Yeah.
That she thought that would make her similar to Laura. She has no clue what Laura's doing.
Nope.
That's the thing she gravitated toward.
She's a diet Laura.
Yeah. Which it makes me sympathize with Donna, and I hate to even say that because I can't stand her character, but I think there's an element of, tragedy in light of the diary. Mm-hmm. And we do get the falling out of the friendship described in the diary to the extent that by the time, Laura's 16, they really weren't friends to Laura's side. We don't really know how Donna felt, but Laura's at that point where she says, quote, "We're like everybody else. We say something is forever when really it only lasts until we're tired of it." And Laura by this point was tired of it. Mm. She realizes also at that older age that she was wrong to think of Donna like a fool just because they'd grown apart. And she also realized that she was thinking of Donna as less than just because Donna had not been made bitter by anyone. Mm-hmm. Laura kind of recognizes in a moment of maturity, I would say, and self-reflection, that a lot of her disdain for Donna was this feeling inside of her that she rejected how much Donna wasn't bitter, how much Donna hadn't been scarred mentally yet. That there's this sort of sense of Laura hating someone who's managed to eke out a better life.
Yeah, genuinely, I don't think that Laura and Donna were good for each other in that respect, especially with how things came to a crashing halt.
And James is that little shining light within the darkness.
No,
James.
No. He is
just
not.
James.
For never.
So we get a startlingly little bit of information on James.
I would say maybe startling, but I think it's like, ooh, this is actually pretty good.
It's revealing how little James mattered here.
Yep.
Because by the end of the diary, okay, so some pages are torn out. You can believe that James was in there maybe. But by the time that Laura's wrapping up the journal and she's close to the end, right?
Yeah.
She hasn't really brought up James much at all. She didn't talk about, like, being into him. She's kind of like, oh, yeah, we're dating. And she also never really gushed about their relationship. Like, as someone who, if you just watch the show, you oftentimes don't really realize how big of a gap there was. Because I don't think at the time of the show there was it explained. How much Bobby's relationship with Laura was so much more important to Laura than her relationship with James.
Absolutely.
James was a little tiny, like, Hello Kitty Band-Aid that she put over all of her wounds. And it's like, at the end of the day, the Hello Kitty Band-Aid wasn't stopping the gangrene.
Oh.
It's just kind of a little cute Band-Aid on top of it. And that's all James really was. So when you realize that that's all there is in the diary, if we take this to be meaning anything, it would mean that he's a footnote. He's a little anecdote. He's a little trivia piece. Like, by the way, there's this guy named James. He's okay.
Yeah, he is something of an entity. I suppose, if anything, he was just maybe an excuse, if anything else.
Because she describes him as being a friend of hers and Donna's prior to the relationship, but she never wrote about him for all those years. Like, how little he must have mattered, which, I mean, does give credence to the idea that James and Donna make more sense for each other, because clearly Donna did think about James.
Yeah, and with this sort of situation, like, we see, like, a little flashback in the series on something that I really didn't feel the romance on, and hey, this kind of, like, justifies that for me, where she's just like, here, have this, after he's like, your hair's so soft.
Which, now that you know what Laura writes like in her diary, how banal, how just nonsense it is for this dude to be like, your hair smells pretty and you smile nice. She's like, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. Good job, buddy. Here's a gold star. I mean, gold heart.
The little bit we get of James is just, she's attracted to his purity. Again, that's the word she uses. I'm just quoting the lady. And it's a secret relationship only because she wanted it to be secret.
Yeah.
She's still kind of with Bobby, but at this point, it's clearly just for the drugs. She's acknowledged that she's not really in love with Bobby anymore. And she sees, honestly, she thinks at this point, Bobby should go with Shelley. So it's just kind of a vestigial relationship for the sake of cocaine. So James is like her last chance. She views James as like a little bit of hope she's allowing herself. How sad.
James?
Like, truly, actually sad if James is that little bit of sweetness, a little bit of hope in her life.
I'm critical on James a lot. Yeah. And I still am.
Yes.
And I will continue to be likely.
Yeah.
Not to mention, it still is kind of, I would say, even leading on James, so there is some pity I do give to James as well. It's just not a good situation.
He had no idea what he was doing.
No, there's like no communication, no consent to what the heck is happening.
Right. So we talked about how James and Donna didn't seem to really get Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
But do you know, strangely enough, who got Laura Palmer, or rather, what got Laura Palmer? Animals.
Oh, that could still be who.
It could be a who, depending on how you view things.
I view animals as beautiful.
Animals are not people. I know. I'm the vegetarian.
If you want to send your complaints to Kalil for not recognizing your animals as people, please email us at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com or yell at him through our Twitter feed at snakeeyedreams1, the numeral 1.
Hey, I'm a vegetarian. Animals aren't people. You eat meat. You eat people.
I do eat people.
Your logic is that animals are people. I consume human flesh.
Did I ever say that I was a good person? I don't think I ever claimed that in the podcast or anything like that.
Perfect person.
Yep.
You know that song by like Hoobastank?
That is exactly the tone I imagined
it's Hoobastank.
It's a song.
Anyway, Jupiter was Laura's cat. It's like I just dropped like a 10-ton weight of sadness by mentioning this.
Yep.
So Jupiter is a cat that Laura had for years. I don't think we get an exact age of how long. Was a cat.
Yep.
I don't think we get a sense of how long she had her, but she's had her for years prior to being age 12. And described Jupiter as being very important to her. I would argue probably one of Laura's best friends, by the way it's described. We know that she wasn't super, super close with her mother and father consistently.
Yeah.
They had some things in common, but I feel like that cat was probably more important to her in some regards as a confidant than her father and mother were. And since she didn't have the diary, I almost wonder if Jupiter heard more of her secrets than anyone else until that diary happened.
Mm-hmm. Likely, and it's unfortunate that we don't really get that far with Jupiter. In fact, there even is just a small little moment where she has a nice little dream, and then later on, we get the fun little story told, which we might be able to imply someone in the situation where Jupiter had unfortunately been ran over.
Yeah. So Jupiter was hit by a car on the road, and we get no real clarity on who did it.
No, I have money on someone, though.
Who?
The person who's really bad at driving when we see him drive.
Bobby?
Leland Palmer, or the Bob.
Leland Palmer.
Yeah, no, where his, the father may have, because, like, that would be close to the home and everything. And there could be enough scrutiny, either A, the father saying that this is sad and it's so sad that this had happened, while not wanting to hurt her daughter, or B, it may have been the Bob part that came through.
I think it's a good headcanon, because it does imply the idea that Bob would see what happens to Laura if I remove this thing of goodness in her life. It feels up Bob's alley.
Not to mention, it would be an excellent way to mirror the sins of the father with the sins of the daughter, where she did later on do that herself. And
if it wasn't a dream.
If it wasn't... Was the dream with the little girl?
That's what we're going to talk about. Yeah. So, the thing you're talking about, right? Later on in the story, Laura has this moment where she's driving distracted because she's reading Flesh World while driving.
Yeah.
Which I would say don't read Flesh World while driving.
Don't read while driving.
But as she's reading, she ends up running over a cat, and Laura notices the girl who owned the cat. Mm-hmm. And this girl's name is Danielle. And Laura, rather than driving off, she stops and consoles the girl. And by consoles the girl, I mean Laura's a sopping mess, and Danielle consoles her.
Yeah.
Because Laura feels this astounding guilt because she knows what it's like to be the little girl who lost her cat. And Danielle is just like, no, why are you crying? What's wrong? And like sympathizing with Laura. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I bring up if it's a dream is because I'm not sure this actually happened. There's no one else other than Laura and Danielle that were around for this event. Uh-huh. And by this point, Laura had already talked about in her diary that she's starting not to know what's real and what's not real anymore. Danielle feels like a lodge spirit.
Now, that might be a case. That might just be real enough with her. Like, we've seen the Tremon boy. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe this is a form. Maybe this is sort of like a Black Lodgian situation where something is being sorted out with some baggage inside of her. And there's some reflection that she must face.
And it's not something Laura ever specifically says is a dream, but I think if anything in this diary was a dream, this is one of the most suspicious events because no one else is around to corroborate it, and we never hear or see anything about it ever again. And the fact that it mirrors Laura's trauma so well, it feels like if it is a real thing, wow, what a crazy coincidence.
Hey, books are filled with crazy coincidences. It's all part of the fiction.
It could be. But it also would be that if this is some sort of weird karma, spiritual dream thing, there's something to that. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Danielle is so overabundantly kind to her.
You could say that the pureness and the innocence of a child is a little bit important in that context.
And I really don't know what to say about this as well, but it is worth noting that the cat is named Jupiter. And we do have references to planets throughout Twin Peaks.
What?
But that's the thing is, like, Saturn and the importance of the Saturn lamp in the Red Room and the planets aligning for the half a year period where the lodge opens up.
When Jupiter and Saturn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the thing is, how important is that when this book was released in between seasons 1 and 2? You can make of it something with it. It's still a little bit suspect that the cat is named Jupiter.
I think that it's important enough for where Jupiter sort of walks, or the way that Jupiter is introduced at the beginning of the book, but not much has gone through. Let's just say maybe Jupiter is starting to get in line, at least for Laura Palmer, where more of the Bob things are unlocked for her.
Well, and there's also the interesting element then, if we're going to go with animals that Laura was impacted by, we get much more of Troy. The
Troy
horse.
is such a weird name for a horse.
Well, and this
I'm
is
okay
where,
with it.
if you want to really read into names,
Yeah.
the only thing I can think of is that Troy reminds me of, like, the Greek legend, the Trojan War. And what I think about that is that in the myths, the Trojan War was fought over one beautiful woman and kind of the fate of that woman.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that the diary is about the fate of one woman, or a girl in this case, wavering in between as people are trying to possess her.
I think that the horse being a gift is important, because the old tale with the Trojan horse being a gift and being sent in with ulterior motives.
So the idea of a gift horse, don't look it in the mouth, and also the idea of the Trojan War, you can try to articulate something. I'm inclined not to read into it that way.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to believe it's just a horse named Troy.
That's fine. That's fine.
I just think if you're going to read into it, that's where I would go.
I'll read into it. I'm in my conspiracy corner. I enjoy me with my Saturn lamp over here.
So Troy originally was supposedly from Leland. Laura received it as a gift from her dad. She later finds out it was actually Benjamin Horne who gave the horse.
Which I wonder what the conversation was. It's just more so Ben just saying, hey, you know what? Your daughter, she deserves a pony.
Maybe there was a deal at the pony shop where if you buy so many ponies, you get an extra pony free.
How many ponies do you think Audrey has?
0. We got that. We actually do get that established pretty much.
Oh, no.
Because he never bought a pony for Audrey, as far as we can tell.
That's sad.
Maybe it's a business deal. He just got a pony from his operations somewhere, and he's like, I don't know what to do with this pony. Give it to your daughter.
Which, by the way, if it's sort of that situation where, he's giving gifts to Laura Palmer, though it's not really, noted immediately that it was from Benjamin Horne. It definitely puts a context in their relationship early on.
I honestly do wonder, because there's 2 possibilities that are floating in my mind. One is that he bought the pony specifically for Laura, because it was Laura's birthday coming up.
Yeah.
The other possibility I'm more inclined to believe is he got the pony somewhere else and thought of giving it to Laura before giving it to Audrey. And knowing that Ben is involved in all these questionable legal deals, I honestly feel like he's like, Leland, I got this horse. Can't really say where for legal purposes. I need this to go someplace. Hey, Laura's birthday's coming up, right? I almost feel it makes more sense in my brain that Ben got a horse through some other random means. It wouldn't be the weirdest thing he's probably got out of a business deal before.
Yeah.
And he gave it to Leland as a quick way to get rid of this horse.
God damn it. Jerry, you cannot trade our businesses for horses. Horses aren't a valid currency.
Cheese pigs, however, are a valid currency.
Jokes aside, I'm more inclined with the former than the latter myself,
enough.
mainly because of how romantic he does reflect on Laura Palmer. I imagine that may have happened later on. Not to mention the way that he sort of deals with the loss of her horse later on.
Yeah.
There's this point where that Laura does let Troy go because that is the romantic thought. That is the thought that you're no longer caged up by me. You're free to do as you need. But that did something horrible where the horse went off and starved to death and could not cope with the wild.
See, in my head canon, I like the extra layer that Ben got it through a shady dealing, because then you have a horse that originally was acquired through some sort of criminal underbelly means that was then masked as a gift from a parent on her birthday, but then actually was sort of this underhand, like you said, a Trojan horse situation. I like the layering of where this horse came from and what its purpose was in the narrative.
Well, regardless, he puts at least Laura's emotions at the forefront enough, because he says that he will find whoever did this to that horse, because that matters enough to him. So, however he handled it, he still thinks it's important for him to do this for Laura.
He still thought of giving it the horse to Laura before Audrey. And so Laura, when writing about Troy, is just amazed by how much this horse seems to understand her feelings. In particular, Laura seems to have a propensity to understand and communicate with animals. Like, not like Aquaman telepathy, but the sense of she really feels like these animals get her and can feel her emotions in a way that a lot of people can't. The closest person I would say to this is probably Johnny, who, not to take this too far into a stretch, but I think the sense of Johnny's mentality being more like a child, one could say. There's that sort of simple-mindedness that he has. It's not a negative, but it's just a part of his personality. I think it's something that she can connect with similarly that she can with an animal.
It's something in which she does delve into more of her impulses and demands that might be considered more simple, more pure.
Yeah, a horse isn't going to judge you. If you say something and a horse looks at you like,
it
really?
means I want apples.
It means I want apples. Give me some sugar cubes.
Yes. Wait, which one is it? Apples or sugar cubes?
And there's a moving forwards. There's a great tragedy, of course, in the fact that the reason why Troy ends up having to get put down and shot down by the officers is that Laura let him out. That Laura let Troy out in this attempt to free Troy, that ultimately got the horse malnourished, in terrible condition, and then executed. And Laura is just, again, racked with guilt. And she feels like she's cursed to only hurt people at that point.
Yeah, it definitely does put a damper on just her trying to, again, have that control, wanting to give that sense of freedom to other creatures because that's what's important to her in the moment, without sort of fully thinking through the situations or being more into the romantic when realistically it's just not good for the horse.
Yeah.
And who knows what that might even reflect onto Laura herself. Maybe that also makes her sort of wheel back on maybe she's questioning how she's dealing with her own actions for herself if she couldn't even take care of this horse and let him to his demise, rather.
And weirdly enough, my first instinct was to think, well, Troy, horse, could it be a white horse like we saw Sarah Palmer see in the episode where Maddie's killed?
Okay.
And no, Troy is described as a cinnamon red and deep brown horse.
Yeah, that sort of coloration, yeah.
Well, to be fair, that sort of dark brown and white is the pattern of the chevron floor as well.
Well, let's just also consider the fact that not only can we think about the more pure white horse, it could be like the sense of death as the common, how the horse usually looks. But we could also think like the most common way to show a ghostly entity is to have it in sort of that white form. Like you will see a white powdered form of the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future.
I'm still sympathetic to believe that is the pale horse of death, right? I'm inclined to believe that is looking at the apocalyptic reading.
Maybe it's a little column B. Hey. We can
horse of many names.
A horse of many names is just as sweet.
Coming to a Hallmark station near you. I don't know how many Hallmark stations you have near you, but it's coming to one of them.
Oh, no. Well, in truth, whenever we have to consider whether or not this white horse is one thing or another, maybe we should put on our white gloves and tell whether or not this man is one thing or another as we look into Leland Palmer.
Maresy dotes and nosy dotes and little lives at Ivy.
Oh.
So,
which, by the way,
yes.
One thing I would like to note,
yes.
Leland Palmer does have a pop figure. And
beautiful.
Oh,
I've seen it. Yeah, I know.
Yep. Why he's got very distinct eyes and he's got very distinct white gloves.
This is why we don't let you see merchandise until you finish the show.
I don't look at the hands too closely, but post this,
it is kind of morbid for a pop figure too. Like I know pop figures will exist for like Game of Thrones and like M-rated things.
Yeah.
But there's something especially morbid about the man who kills his daughter, and among other things, wearing the white gloves, and it looks especially concerning.
No, they do that for multiple pop figures. There's Laura Palmer wrapped in plastic as one of the pop figures.
That's true.
So no, they've put the most noble moments, which in Twin Peaks happens to be the darkest.
There should be a Jacoby one. Jacoby, no, I mean, like, imagine how cool that would look with the red and blue glasses.
I don't
his, like,
want
outfit.
a tiny hula skirt tie.
Oh, but imagine if it's like you can move it too, so it's got like the little skirt part. Anyway, that'd be cool. If you were to give me if you were to have a Jacoby, let's break the tension of this Leland. We don't want to get into Leland right now, right?
Yeah.
What would be your ideal Twin Peaks pop Funko figure if you were to have one? Not sponsored. For me, it's Jacoby. He'd be the coolest design.
I want to selfishly say something like Rosenfeld for obvious reasons. But by the gods, are there just so many shots of Wyndham Earl that I think would just be magical for a pop figure?
Are you thinking of the one with the black teeth?
That's one of the potential ones, like how
the horse. Yeah, you could have a whole lineup of Funko Pop for Wyndham Earl.
Yep, just the Wyndham Earl line.
So speaking of lines, we have to follow the line back over to Leland Palmer.
Oh, no.
We get a decent amount of information on Leland. I guess one question I have is, do you think if you had read this book in between seasons 1 and 2, like let's imagine we read this book in our podcast before season 2, because again, it was released before season 2.
Yeah.
Would you have guessed Leland is the killer?
Maybe.
It's a big what if, right?
It's a big what if, because I can say in my mindset now and looking at the pieces, yeah, it looks noticeable. But then again, I would be more notable to look out for things like that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make a bias where I seem more intelligent than I actually am.
This is as good a point of any to ask that question then. Do you think, for your own self and for general, do you think that someone should read the diary before season 2?
I think that at the very least, when someone should read the diary, it should be either A, after Leland is revealed and what happens to Leland happens, just so we can get the full Maddie Ferguson content too.
Yeah.
Or B, read it after the series like I did.
So you would not recommend reading it after season 1 finale?
I don't necessarily recommend it. I think that, yes, it can pepper in some feelings for people as they go through it, but I think that it's more impactful in retrospect than it is going forward.
I would agree with you too, and it was something I was kind of weighing in my head when we were thinking about Twin Peaks, is when to have you read this for the podcast.
We should have started with the return to Twin Peaks.
I've heard people start with the return, and that seems like the absolute worst idea to me.
No. I didn't finish. Start with the return, but go through it backwards, like the last episode of Return, and just work progressively backwards.
There are some people who probably think that's the best way to understand it. So I
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And strange.
Yeah, it's something. So, Leland Palmer. We can't avoid him forever.
That's a beautiful tagline. Leland Palmer. We can't avoid him forever.
So we know that Laura Palmer said when she was 12 that in her childhood, she and her dad both liked the woods a lot.
Yeah.
Which, again, talk about something being recontextualized if you finish the series.
Yeah.
They have that connection in common, the woods. Now, one clue you could argue from the diary is that where does she usually encounter Bob? The woods. There's a lot of references to the woods with Bob.
Yeah, like the woods of the house.
So we get the sense that she and Leland would go out to the woods. Now, we can hopefully believe that most of that was innocent, that Bob wasn't in control, that it was genuinely Leland with no Bob, and they were just having an innocent outing.
But in truth, there is that layer of Leland who has said that he came across Bob around the lakes, which would be around the woods. So, oof.
And then there's the question of how much does Laura not remember because she's repressing it.
Yeah.
And that's the dark area of this book as well, is that we know all the horrifying... A dark area is that we know all the horrifying things that Laura is aware of. What had happened to her when she was younger that she might have blocked out? Mm-hmm. So when she went to the woods with Leland, was it just a, nature walk? Or was there something more insidious happening there?
Judging from the list that Laura puts up, probably maybe something more at some time. Mm-hmm. Because the first letter in the list of people that she's been with is the letter B.
Well, we know that happened later on. We have pretty good context for that. The question is, how young was she when that happened? And it's a question I hate to ask, but worth considering here with this book, is how long had, in some form, Leland or Bob been with her?
It's important when we have to discuss Bob, when we have to discuss Leland's condition.
And what is Bob versus what is Leland? I mean, according to Leland's doppelganger, I did not kill anybody.
And like I mentioned before, is that Bob talking or is that Leland
talking? We
talking?
came up with a Punnett square of ideas on that one. And I don't claim to know the answer. Mm-hmm. I can say that even from my vantage point, the line between what is Bob and what is Leland has always been blurred and has always been purposefully blurred.
Yeah.
We're not meant to have an answer. I think extremes are wrong. I think if someone says that everything that is bad that happens to Laura is all Bob, I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. If someone says that everything bad happens to Laura is all Leland, I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. I think there's got to be a sense of both. Mm-hmm. Now, 70-30, 50-50, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't claim to know. Mm-hmm. But I think that to say Leland's innocent in this matter, I think is a stretch.
I think that, as I mentioned before in the last episode, Leland, too, is pitiable. It does not condone his actions, or it does not avail him of responsibilities. But at the same time, he was not fully in his right mind and likely suffered from what could be the equivalent, though I will not say that it is, of a mental illness.
It's quite possible that if we take his stories about Pearl Lakes to be quite serious, that he had been shown Bob at a young age as a boy at their summer camp. He might be a victim of trauma himself.
Maybe. And we don't know much about Grandpa at all.
And I'd be inclined to believe personally for myself as well that he was a victim of trauma at a young age, that a wound had been opened up where Bob could enter through. And I think there's that sense in which, again, it does not condone, does not justify, but we might be looking at Leland as a trauma victim with serious repressed emotional baggage that is meanwhile been also supernaturally possessed.
It is.
Because Bob seems to be an actual supernatural entity in this book.
It is a legacy of horrible situations, and unfortunately, Leland was a part of a place that did not help him. And I don't know if there's many people that could have helped him. I mean, our best figure for mental health is someone who even does not like his position with Jacoby. Who
doesn't really care about anyone. Laura's the only one Jacoby seems to actually have an interest in.
And the only person we've seen him be successful with,
Benjamin Horne?
Benjamin Horne, and that's an arguable situation.
Yeah. We do get a rare insight with Leland's relationship with Sarah Palmer, his wife. And part of it we get through Laura's lens of seeing them making love. And making love, I think, is a strong way to put it, because the way Laura describes it, it looks like neither of them are really enjoying the act. Yeah. It's slow and uninteresting to both of them. It's almost just like a thing they do, but not something they necessarily pursue.
It is just a genuine activity off to the side. And again, there's some very toxic things that go on with this. Yeah. I don't know, say, for example, how much in the right mind Sarah may have been in those instances because of what we know happened.
We know that Leland/Bob is not above drugging Sarah Palmer.
Yeah.
So, again, questions.
Yes.
Bob, at one point, when speaking to/through Laura in the diary, says that her parents stopped loving each other a long time ago, and now they're just going through the motions. So if we go by Bob's input, which Bob's in Leland's thoughts.
Bob is in Leland's
But he's also an unreliable narrator if there ever was one.
A, an unreliable narrator, and B, hey, there is a question on if Laura Palmer's Bob is the same thing as Leland Palmer's Bob, because this might just be, let's say, for example, Laura's anxieties or mistrust speaking up. It might be an exploitation on Bob's part, whatever Bob may be.
Yeah. And then the last category I guess I really had here was just the general sense of Leland's nature in the book and kind of the wickedness that we do see. One part that really jumped out at me, it's again one of the more graphic and concerning descriptions in the book, is there's a moment where Laura is wondering, prior to her first sexual encounter, how men's genitals would look.
Yes.
And the only context she's had from a human male is her father when she saw his.
Yep.
Now, it's implied that that's when she saw her mother and father making love. Let us hope that that is where that context comes from. But she describes her dad's member as looking raw, as if it had once been good, but something went wrong with it. And now she describes it as all pink and weird. And if we want to read into that, that's a big yikes.
That's a big yikes.
To put it very euphemistically.
That is something that is, well...
it's one of the biggest clues, I would say, if you're looking at Leland as Bob in this book.
Yep.
Is the sense that that part of him that is hidden away and is used...
excessively
in secretive, dark ways looks that way.
Yep.
That there's a disfiguration underneath it all. I think it's an especially strong, evocative moment, and from Laura's perspective, it is all the more striking and concerning.
Yes.
And I'm glad that it's included in the book, but it also is one of the harder to read sections, is to get that moment. And we don't get her pondering on that later after the fact. It just seems like in that moment of clarity, she kind of thought about how that looked.
Yes.
And we don't get her comparing that later on in life, so I do get the sense that there was something especially off there that she never saw in her numerous encounters with other men later.
Yeah. Oh.
Which, again, for how many men were inclined she was with, the fact that she noticed something being off about him and not really anyone else says something.
It does.
And it makes you wonder how much Sarah Palmer sees these things.
How much is her vision without any sort of things that to cloud it?
We know that she's been, like, whenever she's going through grief, the doctors are giving her something to kind of take away the pain and take away almost the consciousness, it feels like. And Leland, we've seen drug her. We get little inclinations in the diary that she does drink. Now, is it enough to say she's alcoholic? No. But we do get descriptions that when she's at the dinner parties, like the Haywards, she'll get drinking and she'll start slipping out some stories and kind of not really gossip per se.
Yeah.
But she starts to loosen the lips a little bit there.
Yeah, I think that there's also something notable choosing the alcohol problem. I think that might even be a point where Bob could exploit more.
Yes.
Because that slipping something in the drink is probably the most risky thing. Hey, listeners, please keep to your own drinks. Never drink someone else's drinks. Make sure that it's in your hands.
Even if it's someone you feel you know well.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's the people you know well that are close to you that you really got to be careful about.
You got to be careful about this, genuinely. So I hope everyone is well and safe out there.
And so we have situations that are fairly on their own, rather innocent and benign, that at the dinner parties, Sarah Palmer will share kind of embarrassing stories about Laura, about her dreams.
Yeah.
And there's one that you had to have noted on, where Laura doesn't remember dreaming, but apparently in her sleep, she'd been calling her mom's name out and hooting like an owl.
Yeah.
Which, I mean,
owls
at this
are
point,
a little bit
owls,
important.
They weren't as weird yet because this was released before season 2. This was before the line, the owls are not what they seem.
Honestly,
this was like early owl content.
We need more owls around here to just watch us during the podcast just to emphasize how important they are.
Do not get a pet owl, please.
Actually, I do have a little owl statue that, let me see if I can find it.
Why have you set this next to me? What even is it? It's like a bust of like a gentleman with an owl head.
Yep, I think it's best to have it in these situations. So from this podcast onward, that will be our go-to owl, which we will place down for the podcast purposes.
I'm turning it to look at you and not me. I want you to be judged. And I imagine judged is how Laura felt when her mom is slipping out these dreams. But again, on its own, fairly innocent, although it does leave the idea that there's an area of trust being violated.
Yes.
That Laura is in her sleep in a vulnerable state, hooting like an owl, and the mom is comfortable sharing that. I imagine that's a common thing, though, for the moms to share embarrassing stories their kids do, because in Sarah's mind, it's just a cute thing her daughter does that's funny. And again, she's a little on the edge of the alcohol, that it's just she's letting some stories slip.
Yeah, which is not so comfortable for Laura for obvious reasons.
More concerning is that there are moments, Laura writes in the diary, she says, sometimes Mom and I have the same thoughts, the same dreams. And despite the fact that Sarah Palmer's implied to have dreams the way that Maddie and Laura do, and that I imagine those dreams may or may not involve Bob, considering that she lives in this household, and she's seen Bob in the series, when Laura explains her nightmares to Sarah Palmer, Sarah just explains it as puberty. Sarah just whisks it away. She gives a talk about the birds and the bees, about babies, about birth control, and Laura's just having to sit through this, wanting to hit her. That's how Laura describes it. Because everyone around her just keeps thinking all that she's going through is puberty and adolescence, when really there's something more going on.
Yeah.
And the fact that her mother is doing that, when her mother seems to experience dreams, she doesn't take it seriously.
We have to just consider on how present she even is through it and what she could even say in her general condition. I think that there might also be a question on just the general lineage as well on these people, the Palmer and Ferguson households, on maybe that having more of those experiences is a part of their puberty. I wish that we had explored the idea and these concepts more with them talking, but it doesn't seem that there was the healthiest of communication or relationships between Laura Palmer's anxieties as well as generally Sarah Palmer's passiveness.
There's so much in this book that there's obviously a lot of supernatural elements and things that are not relatable.
Yeah.
That are very, very fictional. But I think one of the overrunning themes of the story is how a young woman or a girl turning into a young woman can experience puberty, and puberty acting as a wall or a barrier between people, and also a great agent of change in relationships. That I almost imagine maybe Laura's relationship with her mother was stronger before puberty. But on the onset of adolescence, so much changed for Laura that her old friendships, her old family connections got called into question more.
Yeah.
It became another barrier that other people could just look at her and be like, oh, she's just going through puberty, when she was going through so much more than that.
In truth, like a lot of her experiences, she felt that was too unique to her, and all these unreliable outlets that just didn't understand her as she grew up, that consumed her more and more.
Whereas if there had been more communication and more safety nets, a lot of the things that she was going through, I would assume are not singular. Obviously, Bob and the dreams, yes, they're supernatural things, but a lot of the fantasies she was experiencing and the sexual awakening, that's a thing that girls can go through, or boys for that matter. And it's one of those things that if there had been more communication from her friends and family, how much weaker Bob's presence could have been. He could have been really weakened.
And we do see Laura Palmer's presence as a individual within the Black Lodge. Black-eyed, if you will, regular colored eyes, mind you, instead of the white eyes. I think that her and all these sort of conflicts in which she felt may have been unique to herself, that needs to try to figure that out, but still being caught in that conflict. I mean, who better to be amongst the Black Lodge who is about trying to grind people and those ideals out.
Well, and I also want to just, again, mention, I think that Laura Palmer's presence, both as a doppelganger, but also as a non-doppelganger, is fascinating, considering that the only other people who are shown to be non-doppelganger-eyed are either, like, spirits of the lodge or people we saw going into the door, like Wyndham Earl, Annie, and Cooper.
Yeah.
So Laura, as far as we know, isn't alive walking through the portal and isn't a lodge spirit as far as we can tell.
I'll also mention here, the Z-Day collection apparently has stills for different people to sit in the Black Lodge. The one that they have in default is that iconic thing of Laura Palmer and Cooper kissing.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see what other stills can be sitting in that room. Oh, no.
There's a moment where, going back to Sarah Palmer, that Laura speculates she and her mom could be friends. And her mom probably could relate to a lot of her experiences. But her mom comes from a generation of people who don't talk about their feelings or experiences, and they're not vulnerable with each other.
Yes.
So Laura seems to pin it to a generational standpoint as well, that if her mom would be willing to talk about these things with her daughter, that Laura and Sarah Palmer could be close as mother and daughter if they were willing to talk about those things. But because her mother makes assumptions and jumps to conclusions and won't really talk about it, Laura feels like she can't open up.
Yeah.
Which, again, I feel like, I'm not trying to blame Sarah Palmer. She seems to be a victim in this situation, too, from what we can tell of what's going on. But it still feels like Sarah Palmer was in one of the critical positions to help. And there's that idea that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Or in this case, good moms to do nothing.
Anyone to do anything.
Yes.
Like, she had no one. Like, if we look at Donna, disconnect. If we look at someone like Sarah, disconnect. If we look all over the board, disconnect. Even when she found points of connections, there was still disconnect with nearly every single one of her relationships. If anything, the only one that seemed to work out best for her, sadly, was the Bob one.
Yeah. A lot of the relationships that were the least clearly healthy for her were the ones that felt the closest.
Yeah.
I think you end up with individuals like Leo, Jacques, and Renette understanding Laura better than her old family and friends by the end of things.
Yeah, which, by the way, we'll get towards that and the very interesting perspectives.
Yes.
As far as that goes.
So many characters to get through. We'll get there, but yeah, it's crazy. The last thing I have on Sarah Palmer is there's a moment where we mentioned earlier where Maddie's psychically called, and then Maddie calls her back on like the actual phone. And it's a moment where Laura had been kind of dodging her mom's conversation about how things are going.
Correct.
Typical, teen girl stereotypical, like, it's fine, don't worry about it, mom. Which again, given the context, we know why she doesn't open up to her mom.
Yep.
And when Laura gets the call from Maddie, she looks down the stairs and sees her mom, and there's just a look of pure jealousy, as Laura sees it at least. So if Laura's viewpoint is to be taken at face value, Sarah Palmer seems to be fiercely jealous of the fact that Laura is opening up more to Maddie than to herself. And there's almost a darkness to that I think is very interesting, just for a brief moment that shows through, which is probably one of the more emotionally honest moments we saw between Sarah and Laura. And how sad is that? That the most emotionally honest we see the mom be is when she's jealous of her daughter talking more to her cousin.
It's very... oh, no. This was just not a really great household for anyone to be in.
Yeah, I thought Sarah Palmer's involvement in the book is one of the more fascinating elements personally.
Yeah. Because
it's a character that is so much ignored for the rest of season 2.
Yep.
And there's just that moment where we're just talking about, please, someone check on Sarah Palmer, because now that we know kind of what Sarah Palmer's like, imagine she's been alone in this house now for weeks and months with no Leland, no Laura, no Maddie, because they're all dead.
And
she has that on her conscience.
Which, by the way, Dr. Jacoby leads her over, so that leads into different scenarios.
Yeah,
Either
that her one reprieve is Jacoby.
Oh, no. Which either A, she is seeking out therapy for some of her probably loneliness and problems, and something might have popped out during that time.
Yeah.
Or B, another reality where the Black Lodge residents know Jacoby's number, which I think that's...
I'm also concerned, what is Jacoby prescribing her?
Yeah.
Because Jacoby feels like someone who'd be a little loose with his prescriptions, because we know that he viewed cocaine as self-medication.
Yep.
He spoke positively of Laura's self-medicating tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
Yikes. Jacoby is someone who I think the more you learn about Laura, and you know that Jacoby knew a lot of this. Like, Laura would go out of her way to shock Jacoby. He knew this stuff, and he still thought the drugs were a good thing for her. Now,
Jacoby, please, no, someone take that man's permit away, please.
Granted, if she hadn't done them, would it be better or worse? That's so hard to determine.
Mm-hmm.
But to call this healthy by any means, to call this self-medicating, is so beyond the pale of logic for any decent person that it really calls into question what Jacoby's like.
And you want a pop figure of this man.
He looks cool. I'd say
that's a one positive.
I mean, if I had a pop Funko figure of Bob, it doesn't mean I'm a crazy killer man. It just means he's got a cool design. Jacoby's one of the more striking visually characters. He's really interesting to look at.
I agree with that. I agree that he should be holding a few items inside of his hands if we are to get him.
He's visually arresting, and he should be arrested. Mm-hmm. I'll word it that way.
There we go.
Speaking of should be arrested, Benjamin Horne. Okay, there's not a lot of levity in this podcast, so I'll take it where I can.
Yeah.
Benjamin Horne. I've mentioned it before in the episode, and I couldn't really reveal all my hand in it, but I've consistently found Benjamin Horne's character to be one of my favorites, and I think the element of his connection with Laura Palmer is very interesting, and it's one of the most gray, murky elements, I would say, of Ben's character, in the sense that during the show, we have numerous indications that he keeps photos of Laura Palmer, and that he is someone thinking about Laura Palmer way after everyone else has pretty much stopped.
Yes.
And that the way he responds to Audrey when he starts, going into carrot mode, he starts to think about Audrey and how he can better their relationship. I almost feel like that was the moment, because he worded it like, thinking of Laura, now I want to be better with you, Audrey. It's like he finally, at whatever point, he got to a point where he started to recognize Audrey as his daughter and start to treat her better.
Yeah.
And it's so concerning because on one hand, Ben, I think, genuinely cared about Laura and saw her as almost like a child to himself.
Yes.
It's almost like how a lot of grandparents will pamper a grandkid because they don't have to deal with the kid. They just get to see him now and then and give him gifts and make them smile. And how genuinely heartwarming that can be.
Which is hilarious since, he kind of had that situation with Donna almost.
He almost did, right? So I feel like with Laura, there was that sense of this is someone he can dote on and give gifts with. He didn't do that with Audrey. I feel like Sylvia Horne probably would have put a kibosh to that. I feel like Sylvia got in the way of that. And then, at least from Ben's perspective.
Yeah.
And then he couldn't really do that with Donna because he didn't want anyone finding out that was his kid. So it was plausible deniability with Laura, though, because it was his coworkers or his lawyer's daughter.
Yes.
Someone who had reason to be there enough, someone he could shower gifts with. And again, I want to believe there was a genuine, authentic, healthy love for this child and support that over time became twisted. I don't believe, this is personal headcanon, I don't believe that Ben had any sort of gross dealings with Laura until much later. I don't believe that his involvement with Laura was anything other than good-natured and genuine until the point where she started working at One-Eyed Jacques. At that moment, the fact that Ben would sleep with Laura is extremely concerning for Laura's and Ben's psychological states.
Yep.
That Laura, who grew up knowing this man the way she did, and for Ben knowing Laura as he did, it's deeply disconcerting. And again, it speaks volumes about both their characters. We didn't have a lot necessarily in here about Ben, other than the stuff with Troy.
Yeah.
But the things we did have in here are eye-opening.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of eye-opening things to the corruption of Ben. I don't know if I necessarily fully agree with your end, but oof.
About which part?
With generally what it started out as. Not only is there a sort of appeal that Laura Palmer can give off And maybe there might be argue that there is a little bit of mystical influence from outside bounds that may have aided it. But let's not forget, when Laura Palmer had quote-unquote died, I say quote-unquote because, we did have that one person that could help service Ben and Jerry during their time at One-Eyed Jacques. That looked awfully familiar, if you catch my drift.
I still find that interesting. I have never thought that actress looks like Laura Palmer.
She looks a lot like to me.
I think that's really interesting.
It's so weirdly centered and so weirdly focused if it isn't that case, because elsewise it's just employing the thought that they have fun here.
Yeah.
But
for listeners who don't remember this moment, when we saw One-Eyed Jacques, I think it was like the first time, there was all the girls being presented. There was the one that Ben was going with, the new girl, who the professor thought looked an awful lot like Laura Palmer.
She does look a lot like
I don't think she even has a name, so I can't look her up easily what she looked like. But I always found that really interesting. I didn't want to give you a hint either way, but I've never thought that. And I think that interpretation's really curious. We know that Ben almost did sleep with Audrey.
Yeah.
But that was something where he didn't know that.
Nope.
He didn't consciously do that. But that's another footnote in here that it's amazing that didn't have more repercussions than it did. You almost think, like with season 2, how could Audrey's stomach being around her father? I almost feel like that got waved away a little bit as time went on, that Audrey shouldn't have wanted anything to do with him to the effect that she did. But as soon as he went into Civil War mode, she tried to bring him back just like everyone else. And when he came back with carrots, she was on his side.
I think that there was a lot of, and I'm not saying it's the right decision, and I don't think that many people might come to that conclusion. I think the more likely outcome is as what you've stated. But I think that there's been something implied with the character of Audrey growing up a lot and wanting to preserve the things she thinks is important to herself. Finding the things that she finds will help her growth. I mean, the way that, even though sometimes unsuccessful, the way that she sort of speaks and stands up to her father while also trying to take more responsible roles around the home after all those events, I think might be important enough to her, especially with trying to maybe even push Ben in a better direction. Especially after and during his meltdown.
And I think the diary contents really recontextualize then Audrey's motivations when she does initially try to solve the murder.
Yeah.
That knowing that Audrey and Laura were not close at all.
Nope.
If anything, Laura was keenly aware of Audrey's jealousy and emotional state, that Audrey would go running to her room crying because her dad was putting Laura on his lap and singing songs and giving her ponies and gifts, and Audrey wasn't getting that.
Yeah.
And so Audrey was jealous of Laura for so long, and you can kind of tell the difference in their personalities. Audrey's someone who's constantly has a personality of mischief and messing with things and kind of, oh, Audrey, why are you doing that? Audrey, these are important papers. Audrey, stop doing this. And Laura's just the sweet, innocent girl that no one really seems to understand has that darkness. And early on, episode 1, 2, pilot, Audrey says that she knew...
The order of that just sounds hilarious.
Audrey was saying that she knew Laura better than she thinks a lot of people do. And I'm inclined to believe Audrey was right.
Yeah.
I think Audrey knew the darkness in Laura because she saw the way that Laura would use Ben that way. She saw the way that Laura was willing to twist the knife and actually hurt Audrey and enjoy the power of that. And I think, considering, even though she didn't know all the dealings with her father, I think she had enough exposure to people of shady, dubious character that I think she could see through Laura's veneer a bit better than most others.
I think that solving a little bit of the mystery may have revealed more about Laura, that maybe she may or may not have been fully aware of how much Ben may have known.
Yeah.
And maybe that would have recontextualized things. Maybe that could have even helped Ben with a little bit of closure at the time, and who knows how his reaction would have been in that context. Unfortunately, everything went a little bit wild.
I thought Audrey was the appropriate amount for the book. I think having more Audrey wouldn't have made sense for Laura's story. I think the fact that Audrey's in there about as much as James, again, goes back to how little James mattered. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get you.
At the end of the day, Audrey's almost in there more than James.
Yes.
So one more Horne character shows up in the book, and that's Johnny Horne. I'm really happy we got some context for Johnny a bit in here. He's a character that gets overlooked a lot in the show.
Yeah, but he was important enough to Laura, or at least her past, that, we could argue with James, but that would be far less of an interesting angle, I would say.
Yeah, I'm much more happy to have Johnny Horne content than James.
Yep, I think that we all can agree. Isn't that right, audience? Good.
This podcast brought to you by Dora the Explorer.
Not actually. Not
sponsored by Dora the Explorer. But by Boots, not sponsored. So, Johnny Horne. There's this sense of mutual understanding between Laura and Johnny where Laura feels that Johnny understands her better than a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then Laura, in turn, feels like she can understand Johnny a bit.
Yeah.
That she feels she understands why he's quiet. And she describes his sort of inner world, quote, a strange world of pain and of childhood mystery, or child mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense why later in the book she starts tutoring Johnny. And the primary reason she gives at first is because there's that sense that Johnny doesn't use her, Johnny doesn't hurt her or judge her.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's also the side benefit that she wants to use the money for drugs. That she wants to use the $200 a month she's going to get to buy cocaine.
Yeah.
So as with a lot of things in Laura's life, a lot of the good intentions are underscored by bad. And a lot of the bad intentions have an element of good in them too.
Mm-hmm.
That everything comes with pain and pleasure being mixed with her.
Yes.
Johnny's involvement overall, aside from the money being used for coke, it seems like one of the most exclusively positive involvements in her life.
Yep.
That it's almost a form of spiritual healing for her.
Yeah, it's probably harkens to the days in which like she had to take care of, well, her horse for a time, in which it's someone that she could attend to and work with and may not have had the same abilities to sort of communicate as the usual people do.
Yeah.
But in a more human form. And I think that that's usually where she connects with people the most.
Johnny is someone who can't have a secret from her.
Yeah.
Johnny is someone who can't have hidden motives or betray her or use her, like she said. There's this one moment where Johnny was really receptive to her just sharing stories.
Yeah.
So she went on for like 3 hours just talking about her stories, knowing that effectively the words she's saying don't even really matter, that she could be reading off a grocery list and Johnny would applaud if it sounded like that was the end of a thing to applaud to.
Yeah.
But she likes that. She says Johnny is simply the best listener around. And she actively takes advantage of that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Again, there is that question of like the sense of control and the sense of being able to have a handle on her life that seems to potentially correlate with Johnny. But there also is that little bit of sympathy, I think, that she actually has a point that she can speak aloud, that she desperately lacks in other fields.
It's unfortunate that a lot of the people that she feels she can open up to can't really offer her any help in return.
Yeah.
We can have a temporary levity in the form of Johnny Horne. She can have a moment of peace. And don't get me wrong, there's something very valuable when you have a friend you can talk to and just vent.
Yes.
But at the same time, Laura needs more than just venting. She needs help. And Dr. Jacoby is just interesting her as a case study. Like, he just wants to learn more about her, but not really necessarily help her.
Yeah.
And we get the sense that other people she goes to for her problems oftentimes either do nothing or exacerbate the problem more.
Yes.
And we get also a little rare anecdote into Sylvia Horne, the most elusive character in the entire series, potentially, where there's a moment where after that 3-hour conversation with Johnny, she sees Sylvia Horne home early, and she's surprised not to see her with shopping bags in her arms and a plane ticket in her mouth, which gives a lot of context for Sylvia Horne we never really had before.
Yeah.
That might be the reason why Sylvia Horne is gone all the time, is because she's constantly on trips and shopping sprees.
Yeah.
Which reminds me a lot of Josie.
It reminds me of Josie. It reminds me a little bit of Jerry, though, yeah, I don't know how much his shopping sprees were, but I can assume with his budget for cheese pigs, he might have had some extra money in his pocket.
And that also reveals more about Audrey's possible upbringing.
Yeah.
That Audrey would have been the one in charge of keeping track with Johnny, would have been someone bounced between her father and mother, always distant physically and emotionally.
Yep.
And Ben probably enjoying the fact that he could just ship Sylvia away.
It is a painful reality in the Horne household, to say the least. And there's a lot that we could even speculate about a few instances with Laura.
I mean, after the Palmers, the Horne family might be the most broken family in Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of broken families in Twin Peaks, but
there's a lot of people that need a lot of conversations and a lot of healing.
Which is, I think this book is such a condemnation and rebuking of Cooper and Truman and all these people who are talking about how perfect Twin Peaks is and how the rest of the world is starting to crawl in.
Yeah, no.
But Twin Peaks is this great place.
Ed and Norma are both in unhappy relationships that they are married to. We have someone like Truman who is being actively deceived inside the background, though there maybe have been some love there. There is still that layer of secrecy that was never given from Josie. There's the fact that James had a poor life with his mother. Can you name for me one healthy relationship here that is not Toad's relationship to the Double R Diner?
I think you can make a case that Doc Hayward and Eileen have a good marriage.
Okay.
There are obviously secrets to keep from their daughter, but what happened between Eileen and Ben was so long ago in the past that for everything we're given, it seems like the Hayward marriage is a healthier relationship.
Yep,
we don't have a lot of evidence to the positive. We just have a lack of evidence to the contrary.
I mean, at the very least, we don't have to worry about on-screen when the Hayward household pushes the two other daughters into the pit in the middle of Twin Peaks as they disappear at the end of the series. But
I don't buy into what Cooper and others say about the town being special or perfect or great. I even question Jean Renault's lines about everything was simple before Cooper arrived. Clearly that is not the case at all.
I think simple in the respects of you didn't have to dig up the baggage. Like, this is where Cooper is He's
exposing wounds.
He's exposing wounds inside of Twin Peaks, and that is not going to be best for people. Let's just face it, if Cooper wasn't around, who knows how quickly shut away a situation like Laura Palmer's would be on how Ben may have been able to continue his actions in the background, how Cooper would not have engaged with Truman to be so active in some of these roles. How even like Wyndham Earle would not have even been involved.
To use the apt metaphor here, there had always been this fire going, but I think he added so much timber to this fire that it could now ignite much bigger, much quicker. There's an explosiveness to this fire that had been simmering for years.
As you escape the burning woods, you shout out loud, "Fire, run with me!"
Last thing I have on Johnny is he gets to say his first sentence with Laura.
Yeah.
And he says, as his first sentence, "I love you, Laura."
Yeah.
Which, how often does Laura hear that without there being an asterisk or an extra tag or some sort of prerequisite?
Maybe there might have been like that asterisk maybe on Laura's end, but hearing out that what I would say is almost a pure sense of fondness, and I would not imagine any ulterior motives really from him. Yeah, I think that is a very... it's a situation that I don't know what words I can put to.
Sure. We mentioned Doc Hayward a little bit. He was in the book to some degree.
Yep.
Not a very large character. I know I've had my misgivings about Doc Hayward's personality, but Laura does seem to think of him as really the kindest man she's ever known.
Yeah.
And that she would be afraid to disappoint him. Not because he would do something, but more afraid of what that would mean that she stooped to that level to disappoint someone she respects.
I think that Doc Hayward has an insight that, though we may not agree on it, it certainly is an area of wisdom that I can see people looking up towards, where he sort of sits people down and just says that things are never simple. Whether it is saying whether or not, like, Ben is the father, or if it is a situation with little Nicky, the devil that he is, that his situation was just far more complex. He's the one that sort of puts his foot down in many situations. Of course, I completely disagree with, like, the situation with him and Rosenfeld. Yes. But there still is enough of that emotional knowledge and passion with the people of the community that I can see where respects like Laura would look up to him.
And yet he also is of that generation like Sarah Palmer that they don't feel comfortable talking about their feelings with their children. And they don't open up. And that sort of lack of communication between the parent and child creates a lot of problems for their daughters.
It creates some problems, but I don't know how much of the problems would have been in retrospect as well.
Yeah.
It's that closed case that I wonder how much I should trust Doc Hayward on how much he knows his own daughter and what might be able to assist her be best, or if it is simply a mistake on his part.
And one thing I will say with clarity here, because I it's hard to sometimes gauge actual feelings when we do joke, we do comment. I do have my problems with Doc Hayward morally. I still think he's in the wrong a lot of the times he's talking to people and having these arguments.
Yeah.
At the same time, his errors, or at least what I see as errors, they're very human. They're very normal. They're the kind of mistakes that parents can make. They're not wicked, evil deeds. They're nothing close to the sort of evils we get with Ben and with Leland. Doc Hayward's problems and flaws, in my opinion, are the sort of mundane problems that plague a lot of child-parent relationships of dishonesty and lack of communication, coming from a place of good intentions, of trying to keep the family together, of trying to keep the family happy. But ultimately, I would still side on the argument that you keep that lie hidden long enough, it's just going to fester.
I think that there is something to be said about his lines and the way that he communicates to people is maybe his outlook that these situations aren't necessarily something to be healed, but there are simply scars that must have a bandage over them for a time that might need that cast or that medical attention. And that certainly shows in his actions on, well, how he like puts up this perspective again with little Nicky or with Rosenfeld.
As Ben says, time heals all wounds. Just put a cast on it. Put a Hello Kitty Band-Aid on it.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, Ben, because his scars definitely do highlight with, hey, specifically the character, Doc Hayward.
Yeah. Speaking of doctors, we've talked around him. Let's talk about him. Dr. Lawrence Jacoby.
I mean, we don't have to. Like,
we probably should.
Let's just like...
I feel like we'll have a deep regret in our heart that has symbolically been cut in half and it's stuffed inside of a coconut shell. So we get a little bit of Dr. Jacoby toward the end. It's, again, not really a big focus. He's not in there a ton.
Nope.
It feels like Jacoby is one of several side quests that she engages in that are temporary distractions. It keeps her mind busy.
Yes.
And they're also failed outlets. It's outlets that she's not able to heal properly.
Yeah.
Johnny is one that gets the closest, arguably, because it allows her a safe place to vent.
Yes.
She's also able to vent with Jacoby, but instead of a simple affirmation of love and interest and excitement to hear her, Jacoby's interest in her has a sordidness to it. That the way she words it, that Jacoby's fallen in love with the two Lauras. The thing that she considers a curse, the thing that's honestly made her want to die, is something that he finds enticing, that he finds something honest in the way she expresses. He's almost putting her pain on a pedestal. And that's a very dangerous thing to do for anyone, let alone someone whose whole profession is helping people. He's much less interested in helping her than finding more about what's wrong with her.
It seems that his general disinterest and disdain for his overall position, and with this very unique point, he is almost taking the route that it's going to give him something more than it will give Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
And that is not the way a doctor should behave.
Right.
Hot take, I know.
And the fact that they have to meet in secret like this, it's not to like protect her confidentiality. It's to keep this off the record, off the books. He doesn't charge her. It's just kind of this thing where he lets her come in and vent her feelings. He asks some questions. And like Johnny, he accepts her. But again, it's an inversion of it. It's a distortion of that, where Laura's trying to shock him with the details of things. And no matter what she throws at Jacoby, he always forgives her and accepts her, because at the end of the day, he believes that that light, good part of her, again, that duality, he believes there's that duality. That light, good part of her never meant to do those things, so it's okay, Laura. It's fine.
Then I don't think that that's an appropriate way to really work with it. I think that there's more discussion needed. But really, I think Jacoby is addicted to Laura like Laura would be to drugs. I think Laura is his drug.
Yeah. Which, again, it's one of those things that early in like season 1, they really explored that. And Jacoby's character never got back to that later.
Nope.
There was that moment where he said his investigation into Laura's death will be ongoing. And he meant not just the who killed her, but what Laura was to him and what it meant. And there was that sort of note that when he was at the funeral, he didn't want to go during the daytime. He didn't want anyone else to see. He just wanted himself with Laura in privacy. He doesn't like anyone else in this town even.
And who knows, maybe that just like that perspective continues to sort of fester and grow with him, if you will. Like, he might still have that active investigation for the rest of his life. Maybe he might even just try to find someone who is like Laura Palmer, or find the pure essence of what Laura Palmer was for his own selfish needs.
So far in here, would you say there's been any jarring disconnects between the book characters and how they act in the show? Because so far we've been doing a lot of comparing and kind of unifying. We have not had any instances so far that I can recall. I mean, we've been recording this for a while now. It's getting to be a beefy boy.
It's a beefy boy.
But so far we haven't really had any moments where we're like, this feels out of character.
No, I think that when it comes to these characters, so far, not much out of character, there is some extra perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that theme is going to continue on.
But it like gels with what we know about them.
Yes.
We're able to accept the new information and sort of schematize it in our brains.
Schematize?
Yeah, like the gestalt. Getting it all literary theory on you, right? It's that idea that we're able to take our pre-existing ideas of these characters. The book introduces an idea to us, and I think it's been effective so far in having that gel experience where we're not like, wait a second, this feels off. The only time we've really had that so far was with how 12-year-old, 13-year-old Laura writes.
Yeah.
And that's less a disconnect with Laura and more a disconnect with how we think 12 or 13-year-olds write.
Yeah.
But considering we don't have any other 12 or 13-year-old Laura to compare to, maybe that's just how Laura writes. Maybe
Any
Laura
other
was
12
like
or
that.
13-year-old Lauras. If all Lauras could tell us how you could
If
write.
you're 12 or 13,
don't listen
don't
to
listen to this podcast.
Stop. Please.
Stop. Not even our other episodes. Don't listen to
No.
this. But no, in all seriousness, so far we've been able to gel the book into the show pretty easily, right?
I'd say so, so far.
So the next character we have, I think, is one of the characters we get the most, I wouldn't say changes, but drastic perspectives on, for me.
Yes.
One of my favorite characters of season 1, who I think was kind of in season 2,
Yeah.
Bobby Briggs.
Bobby Briggs.
Love Bobby Briggs. I think he's amazing in season 1, and part of it's because I know more about Bobby, and I was never really allowed to let on that I knew more about Bobby.
Yeah.
But when you don't really have the context of him with Laura, it's easy to underestimate how much her death resonated with this kid.
Hey, Kalil.
Yeah.
Hey, Kalil.
Yeah.
I want to call you out on something.
Call me out.
You made a little slip up.
What'd I do?
Talking about Bobby Briggs. You told me, like, in the middle of a podcast, you were like, hey,
yeah.
Bobby Briggs. Like, yeah, he killed a man, right? He's like, what? No, who? Are you sure we're talking about the same person? But no, it was in there.
Okay, I thought there might have been a reference to him killing someone in the show.
I mean, good save on your part because it
my
flew it up
save
over
was
my
me
head.
just to pretend I was crazy.
Yeah.
That's all I did.
That's a good save because I can believe you're crazy. So
Thanks.
kudos. But as far as this goes, yeah, no, this is Bobby.
I mean, yeah.
That's one thing
So Bobby has killed.
that Bobby has killed. But that's the later Bobby. The first Bobby that we get is a little bit more, let's just say, how usually characters seem to start out on this, a little bit more pure.
Yeah, we love to throw that word around. Every time we say the word pure, don't take a drink. don't take a drink, please.
Please.
This podcast too long and we keep doing this. It's not good. So when we get the first intonations of it, it's actually more she writes about how he used to be in the past. We get glimpses of him as a child.
Yeah.
So we get these moments described where Bobby would pull Laura's pigtails.
Yep.
And he made an effort to pass her by in the hallway more than he really needed to.
Yep.
He always had this sort of childlike crush.
Yeah, I think that's usually the short form whenever, like, trying to pay attention more to girls, that they'll do something nasty. I was not the type of child to do that. I had not seen that type of child do that, but
I was
maybe they exist.
developmentally awkward and had no clue what I was doing socially. So
I like books.
I was confused. Anyway, so Bobby starts dating Laura when it seems like they're both age 14. We don't exactly know his age versus hers, but maybe he's a year older. I don't really know. So 14, 15 in that area.
It's the Twin Peaks babies I was talking about before.
Yeah. And at first, Laura writes that seeing Bobby is fun. But it doesn't take very long for us to get the idea that a lot of why she thinks Bobby is fun is because he can be anywhere she wants him to be, and he can bring whatever she wants him to bring.
That sense of control, man.
So it's that control you keep talking about, as well as Bobby was an enabler who essentially, without himself seeming to be addicted to these things, we know he would drink with her, he'd smoke with her, he would do a line with her, but it never gets across the idea that he was in it. He was in it deep.
Yeah.
And we can go by the rest of the show. We don't have moments of Bobby going through withdrawals. It seems like the drugs never did much for him, which I think is really telling that the reason he stuck around, the reason he did all this was Laura. It wasn't really Leo. They were friends, but like not that close, especially later on.
Yep.
And by the time he's still selling drugs at the beginning of the show, it seems like the last time he ever sold drugs was the beginning of the show.
Yep.
He and Mike split from that business as soon as Laura's dead.
But hey, Leo didn't let him forget.
Right. There's the sense that Laura from the beginning wanted to use Bobby for the drugs. There was a sense of she liked him. She might have even had a sense of love for him, but there was always that asterisk. There was always that extra, clause involved in it that for Bobby wasn't there. Bobby's intentions very much were that he had a crush on this girl, he really fell for her, and that is what it was. And he was willing to do anything.
And it seemed like even socially, that was the sort of like emphasis, this little, let's say, highlight relationship inside their overall social standings. And that makes it all the more sad for Bobby and his situations that do surround Laura.
Everyone would look on the outside and think how good Bobby and Laura have it made, that, you know, their football star with the homecoming
Best
queen.
person ever.
Well, soon to be homecoming queen later, but even younger, super, super popular. And these two just seemed on the outside to be just a great couple.
Yeah.
But the internal world of that was constant danger of running into dangerous criminals and the drug selling, and the unfortunate element that they were never really on the same wavelength emotionally.
Yeah.
That every time Bobby tried to put himself forward, Laura had to push him away.
Yeah, no, there is a lot of, like, I would almost say trust issues that ended up sort of bubbling over for Bobby, in which I imagine that he may have probably emphasized that onto others enough, and maybe even got a little bit of that Laura Palmer desire for a little bit of control himself.
Yeah.
Like having these other relationships on the side.
Yeah.
And also just trying to find ways in which he can find himself desirable to other people. He wants to be desired for the lack of desire that Laura gave back to him.
And one thing that I think is important to highlight, and honestly I would say beneficial to the character of Laura and to the writing quality, is that although it's difficult to deal with and talk about, Laura is a victim who also is a victimizer.
Yep.
And it shows a sort of cyclical, complex nature that isn't just trying to make you feel pity for Laura Palmer. She's a victim, she's a victim, she's a victim. Yes, she is. But we see Laura corrupting others.
I think
we see Laura hurting others. And I think that's a much more dynamic and oftentimes realistic portrayal of how these things can turn out.
Yeah, I think that there's a legacy to pain and to suffering and to the frustrations. I think that there will be enough that will likely come out into relationships, especially social, when one cannot handle themselves, if you will. So,
and I do wonder sometimes ethically, like how I feel about Laura Palmer in the book. Like the inclusion of the supernatural elements to me make me wonder, is it bad to dramatize so much suffering for the sake of this supernatural detective hokey soap opera show? Is it almost this book a little voyeuristic and a little predatory in itself? But I also think that the place this was written by Jennifer Lynch, I really think that she was earnestly trying to capture this character and her version of this character.
Yeah.
I don't think that she was doing anything morally bad with writing this.
Yes.
And I think that every reader is going to come to it with their own expectations and own ideas. I don't think this book is trying to exploit it.
No.
But I could see a moral argument against this book in the way it does things, because in the real world, there are victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault. There are victims of drug addiction.
Yes.
And they don't have demons called Bob wearing denim jackets. They don't have owls and all this nonsense. Is it in some way mocking unintentionally real suffering by adding these fantasy elements into it?
I don't think so in my personal interpretation. I think that having Laura juggle all these things and almost having this schizophrenic like Bob being an ever presence around her, I think that I find stories like this interesting and enticing, because having something present like that and having that sort of metaphor, almost in like a mythological sense, looking into stories of people and these other creatures outside, can be used as a coping mechanism for more understanding the general nature of people, spiritually or otherwise. I think that stories like this can be of import using elements of fantasy, because sometimes it's very difficult to communicate what might be presently going on in someone's head. I think that's fantasy is a shorthand that can be used effectively. But yes, at some times, if not handled well, it can downplay some issues. I don't think the case, at least in this book, is that case.
Right. And I would say the show, for the most part, doesn't do that either. There are moments where I still feel that the lack of Sarah Palmer and lack of Ronette is suspect.
Yeah.
In place of, again, how Nadine is handled, I could very much understand criticism of how Nadine is handled. But going back, actually, you might be shocked. I actually agree with you for the most part.
Yay!
I very much agree with you. I think that sometimes we use fiction, we collectively people, Everyone's
Just
different.
You.
I don't mean to
all.
use we to assume you, the listener, are included. You may or may not be. I don't mean to speak for anyone else. But generally, a lot of times people use fiction to understand things that you haven't lived yet, or to understand things you have lived from a different perspective and contextualize your feelings. And I think sometimes mythological figures and spiritual figures like Bob, like the owls, like what Twin Peaks offers, it's a way to mythologize painful ideas and painful subject matter and give it a face, give it a voice. And no, it's not realistic in that regard. It's hyper-realistic. It's beyond real. And sometimes those over-dramatized, hyper-real depictions help us grapple those things more clearly.
Yes.
It's easier to talk about the thing that you can see rather than the thing that you can't see.
Yes.
A lot of times pain is unseen, and I think a lot of times Bob is pain manifest. And Laura Palmer's experiences are exaggerated beyond what most people would ever deal with. But it's the sense of reality in the fantasy that I think stands out stronger than maybe if it would only been reality and no fantasy.
Yes.
Going back to Bobby Briggs.
The other Bob.
Great side tangent, though. I appreciate it, Professor.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bobby. They have this sort of expectation with Laura that she didn't want to come on too fast to Bobby about sex because she wanted Bobby to still think she's this sort of innocent-minded 14-year-old girl.
Yes.
And even in their first encounters, though, you can tell that's not quite the case because she describes it as kind of looking for a place, quote, where she could go kind of crazy on him. She picks like this abandoned shed, and Bobby and them, once that happens, once they've been drinking, smoking, and they have their first time together in that way, Laura is in control from start to finish.
Yes.
And clearly in control to the extent that she's not the virginal-minded, pure, quote-unquote, Laura Palmer that Bobby might have been led to believe.
Yes.
Not that Bobby was necessarily complaining in that moment, but that expectation already would be shattered in that moment, too. And concerningly, during oral, she thinks of Bob, and that's brought up.
Yep.
And I don't know if it was clear which way she was thinking of Bob and like how exactly, nor do I necessarily want the details.
Like, if we have to be honest, like the sort of explanation of Leland's individual part, and in the order of the list, being that the first letter is B and the second set of initials in order of sexual experiences is BB.
Yeah.
That is likely a similar case.
And yeah, so that would mean, is she then thinking of Bob as the receiver of the action, in which case she's manifesting Bob's image over Bobby.
Yeah.
Which, again, if you want to get interpretive and Freudian, the fact that she goes after Bobby when Bob is already a presence is, I mean, more than a coincidence, potentially. It's a skeptical thing. I've always found the use of naming in Twin Peaks curious when there are names that clearly overlap. And I'm sure when you were trying to do your detective work about the naming and the initials,
to this day,
there's so many things you can overlap.
Yeah.
And right after their first time, which, again, Bobby was nervous before, he's astonished afterward. Right after that happens, kind of in that post-coital ecstasy almost, Bobby at that point confesses his love to Laura.
Yes.
And immediately his motivation is to swear his loyalty to her. And Laura's trying not to listen to this. Laura desperately does not want that love inside of her to happen. Mm-hmm. She is fighting against it. And this is almost the moment, I mean, I don't think there's like one moment for this, but if I were to pinpoint one situation where Laura has that split, where Laura has a fracture point, this is where I would point it out. And it's not Bobby's fault.
No.
But it's the fact that Bobby unintentionally is the catalyst for causing this massive division in Laura, or at least expanding it further than it ever had been.
Yeah, because let's just face it, like, there's a constant theme of Laura seeking out ways of, like, control and power. Let's just face it, there would be a point in which one could say Laura having someone very devoted to her in that fashion, saying that love and wants that loyalty. That is, like, the emphasis of control. Now, whether or not, like, that might be too much to the point that she might be able to hearken that to Bob, or, let's say, for example, a theme of Twin Peaks in which love being enough and that sense of love being indicative or the opposite of what might be desired by, say, for example, the Lodge, something pure, that is something that she can't accept, both aids in the belief on why she's a resident of that Black Lodge, and also on this divide on what Laura Palmer is.
Mm-hmm. And part of the way she words it is that Bobby wasn't challenging enough. Mm-hmm. That Bobby is fun, is a good distraction, but there's part of her that feels he's too easy. There's not enough of a challenge.
Yeah.
And the other part of her is trying to rationalize this by the idea that she's going to save him for when it's safe for the nice Laura to come back, when the soft Laura to come back, when the vulnerable Laura can come back. That's when Bobby's love will count.
That she's protecting him. I find it very interesting on trying to keep the safety of someone in her to be important. If there's one thing I can recommend for anyone out there that wants to have a few of these narratives played around with, a professor recommendation. I don't think that Kalil has seen it himself. I'm not going to say too much to not spoil. Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol does have some similar themes of trying to protect something so innocent inside oneself that I find interesting and can kind of compare to some of this Laura Palmer talk we're having at this moment.
In the time of recording this in April 2021, where could a listener find this show if they wanted to watch it?
HBO Max.
HBO Max. Not sponsored.
Yeah, not sponsored. Used to be on DC Online, but it seems that Warner Media kind of moved it over there. And the second season is exclusive to HBO Max.
And it's like a superhero show?
It's a superhero show that's super dysfunctional, and it definitely plays more with general emotions of beings rather than being a superpowered fantasy. If you want heroes to be good, competent, and completely mentally well, do not go to Doom Patrol because you're not going to find it there.
Fair enough. One of the lowest points, I guess I would say, for Laura in the entire diary, when I'm reading it, is how she responds to Bobby's adorations of love.
Yeah.
At that first night together, where when Laura says all this, she has to laugh at him, and to laugh so hard. It says, quote, she had to laugh at him hard until his eyes lost their light. She had to laugh the light out of him.
That is... let's just face it. Like, remember how like Leland had reacted, like having to step around the corner and that deep laughter that just was missed in context. I just think that is a very Bob thing to do.
And Laura's rationale is it's self-protection. It's this idea that she needs to protect herself from feeling that way because that adds a vulnerability, and a vulnerability is not what Laura needs right now. Laura needs to be strong. Laura can't be vulnerable. Bob will get her if she's vulnerable. She's got to laugh this boy away, and she even comments in the diary that she had to laugh at the face of a boy who might never be this honest ever again.
And that's the biggest fallible part. I think that she might even be making excuses or trying to fill in the blanks on why she has to do it. This is her reason. But at the same time, like, the stronger thing is like, oh, well, thank you. And just like being a stance of a leader, but that would possibly have too much control.
And she seems to be aware to some degree of all the layers of this because she's even wondering to herself if she's being tricked into ruining this.
Yeah.
She feels like maybe it's Bob doing this and not her. So she goes through all these mental gymnastics, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, in that moment where someone says they honestly love her and they would do anything for her, she laughs at them.
Yep.
And again, knowing where Bobby is in the series, it says a lot.
And I don't think that she really has that, at least that intense of a moment beyond with the exposure of quote unquote love or what someone feels or what one would feel is pure. That has been a very important part of the show, an invitation, if you will.
Yeah. And I mean, it again recontextualizes what we've seen in season 1 and 2, where Bobby at Laura's funeral was over here waving his hand over the fire and the lighter, and his father has that talk with him. And Bobby is like making fun of everyone around him. He's mocking them. He's basically criticizing that everyone did nothing to help Laura. And he does add himself to that. He says that he didn't do anything either. And you see him like mocking the Jesus crucifixion in the church. Yep. I think there are so many layers, whether Bobby's actor Dana Ashbrook knew it. I don't know how much of this character had been decided, but that's really one of my highlights for season 1 is how Bobby reacts at Laura's funeral. And yeah, it's immature. Yeah, it's a teenage rebellious phase and he's out of his mind.
Hey, fitting.
At the same time, I'm glad Bobby said something. It may not have been eloquent, it may not have been the best worded, but he was willing to, in that moment, call out the fact that Laura was in danger. You all should have done something about this. I should have done something about this. And considering how many people were around that could have done something, I think there's probably more people to point at and blame than innocents in that crowd.
Everyone wants to sit inside that dream, that false reality that feels nice, but when you dig deeper into it, there are problems throughout, especially with Twin Peaks and especially with, like we said, comments with Truman.
Yeah.
Twin Peaks is truly a dream.
Yeah, the happy, innocent girl who lives down the lane isn't necessarily doing as great as you might think.
No. In truth, the presence of such need to be dug deeper into for you to have a better understanding of your full situation. And ignoring it is going to do nothing. Lack of communication is going to do nothing. That's fitting for Laura's story, and that's just fitting for Twin Peaks.
I found this particular part of Laura's diary to be rather haunting in her descriptions. She says, quote, "I'll become a professional at not feeling anything. I am lost. I am lost." And then ... there's a bit more.
Yeah.
But a stronger, more manipulating Laura is rearing her head. There's this sense of that she can tell that the stronger, more manipulating one is there. And I think it's that duality that you could argue that the more manipulating Laura is more like Bob. And I think that's true.
Okay.
At the same time, that stronger, more manipulating Laura is also her best effort at defending herself against Bob. And there's that sort of inner conflict that the more Bob-like she acts, the stronger she feels against Bob.
Yes.
It's that sense of she needs to attack others and manipulate others and use others to build up enough strength to keep herself standing. And it's an incredibly volatile situation, not only for her, but for everyone else that gets caught up in that tornado. And Bobby later calls her to apologize. Because he thought, maybe I shouldn't have said it. Maybe I did something wrong. And she can tell on the phone he sounds rehearsed. Like he's been going over what to say because he feels awkward. He feels bad. He blames himself.
Yeah.
And again, Bobby is no innocent in Twin Peaks. He killed a man. But at the same time, it's hard not to look at Bobby after the diary and notice more of his perspective and how much he's a victim in this whole situation too.
Yes.
And speaking of which, Bobby killed a man.
Yeah.
It was a drug run that went badly. And Bobby shot the shady drug man. And it was like not enough in Twin Peaks for it really to catch on traction in town. It's not something that people would ever catch him for or talk to him about. But in the background, canonically speaking, if we consider this book canon, that means that Bobby, prior to the first episode of the show, had actually killed a person before. And he just walks around town with that on his conscience and just doing his thing.
Yeah. I think that... Let's just face it, there's a lot that I think goes into that submissive nature that Bobby does. I've compared him to a leech, but almost out of necessity. Between trying to deal with Laura Palmer and just trying to, I would say, hold on to whatever is left of that situation, as well as probably the complacency of making any deal he can to get out of situations. Let's just say that might be an important attribute to be, defensive when, if the law catches up to him or if people catch up to Bobby for what he did. It really does make sense on why Bobby is the way that he is. I think that's scary.
I think this book does a good job strengthening a lot of the characters from the original show.
Yeah.
And one of the characters I believe is strengthened the most is Bobby. I think he's a lot more dimensions are added to his character than were there before.
Now, how many people has Tim Pinkle murdered in which he seemed to be also a leech and tried to
I didn't want to spoil this for you, Professor, but
oh no,
you know how you looked at the secret history of Twin Peaks and it said Agent TP?
We're making this joke, and maybe this will be the reality. Maybe this is the you trying to throw something in my path to say, hey, what if it is? Ha ha ha, and so, then Professor, me less think about it? No, I don't want to think about the
Agent Tim Pinkle.
Tim Pinkle. No.
FBI.
No. We don't know if it's FBI, but still, no.
That's the lie. It's not FBI. It's some other organization.
You know something I don't know. I know something that I don't even want to conceive.
So wrapping up Bobby here, I almost imagine like there's a meter where as the Bobby meter goes down, the Leo meter goes up and vice versa.
Yeah.
It really does feel like the more Leo gains in Laura's life, the more Bobby slips away. And, talk about a character who's recontextualized is Leo.
Absolutely.
But Bobby here, he's selling drugs for selling cocaine on Laura's bidding. He's selling them with Leo as kind of in charge of things. But all he's really getting in exchange is that Laura will act more like his girlfriend. She'd go on more dates, which is, again,
it's
so
a dream.
sad.
It's a dream. Gotta hold on to that facade.
There's a moment where Bobby kind of pokes through this facade, and he says, Laura, you'd choose cocaine over me. And Laura says, some days I would choose coke over you. And some days I would choose Coke over anyone. And so, ouch. There's the idea that maybe Bobby's second best to cocaine is the best, most favorable way to read that.
But
he knows it. He knows this. He's not ignorant of this.
It is such a heavy line for a character like Laura that I genuinely... It's one of the 15-year-old ones.
And this is a 15-year-old at the time saying this.
Let's remind ourselves at every point of the story, Laura's a minor.
Yeah.
16 and younger.
Yeah. It's so tough, though, because unlike Donna, unlike James, unlike a lot of the ignorant teen characters, Bobby knows a lot more of what's going on and knows his place. He knows that he's just the one who gives drugs to Laura. And his vantage point is, well, can we at least go on dates sometimes? Like, he's trying to use the little bit of leverage he has as her mule to have some time with her.
It's a sense of comfort that he genuinely has, but at the same time, there's also that little side relationship that he has with Shelley Johnson.
Yeah.
In which, whether or not like it's a situation where he's getting something that Laura does not provide him, or if it's a situation where there is an emotional high of being with someone that is tied to someone who could probably kill him, and is his personal drug.
I think it's really layered. I mean, Laura sees how Bobby looks at Shelley. Laura knows what's going on. She suspects that they're either going to have an affair soon or already have been. And she basically, in at least her diary, gives him her good graces. She's like, that's good. That's a good thing. It's tough because it feels like, for me, there's that layered element where if he goes for Shelley, you have there's the high of it. There's the high of going after the forbidden love that, if he is found out about, it could kill him. But there's also the element that potentially, even unconsciously, Leo corrupted his love. Why wouldn't Bobby want to go after Leo's girl, almost as like an exchange?
There can be that, and you can also say that they're just in similar situations. Shelley and Bobby can relate a lot for their darker other halves.
And also Shelley being the housewife, being the stay-at-home housewife. She's someone that can fit that angle of purity more than potentially Laura can at this particular venture. There's a moment where Laura writes, quote, "Falling in love is like waving a white flag to your enemies and saying, I give up." And she basically says that she can't fall in love until Bob is dead for sure. She refuses. And again, if we think that love is something that can combat Bob, if we think his love is something that could fight it, the fact that she thinks she has to wait for love until after Bob is gone, she's getting rid of the greatest weapon in her arsenal to protect herself. She's removing the best chance she has in that regard.
Yeah.
And if she would have... And of course, you want to be careful. You don't want someone who's desperate to jump into love too readily and end up hurting themselves more. But outright refusing love, outright refusing affection is so much going to hurt her that, again, it reminds me of that last episode where Cooper says to Truman, I have to go alone into this place of darkness. I think Laura had a similar mentality where she has to go in alone. She can't afford to face Bob with any vulnerability or anyone around.
Yeah, like neither of them were ready for their respective situations. Oof. And sometimes the world just comes crashing down a little bit too soon.
And she's even described at this point that almost the sex has become an act of revenge more than love. So even that's been distorted.
Yeah.
Which for a lot of the time in the book, again, is that dual nature that the sexuality of Laura Palmer has been a double-edged sword. It's been, on one hand, a force that's given her vulnerability to dangerous people, particularly dangerous men. And it's also been something that has given her a comfort and given her a solace. It's something that she has power and control over in a life where she feels she has no power and control. It's always dangerous to her, but it's always one of her few joys.
Yeah, it's one of the few situations where no matter who the person is she is facing, other than Bob, she seems to be in complete control, and she is able to have whims against these individuals, no matter how dangerous they may be.
And none of these situations are healthy. None of these are healthy.
Zero.
Bobby was the first and the closest to being that way. But as soon as he confessed anything love afterwards, she laughed at him and shut him down. Leo Johnson's interesting then in that regard, that he never makes any pretensions of love with Laura.
No.
There's never any mentions of that. Even as friends, they're not really friends.
But at the same time, Leo can be clear with her. Leo can communicate with her. One of the most important parts, I think, that involved Leo is that when things turned sour, there was a point where Leo had tended to her. So I think that these contexts are important because, hey, this is not a side of Leo Johnson we've seen.
Leo Johnson's very interesting in this book, and having this context of him, I don't mean to be rude to the actor. I think Eric DeRay did a greater job later in the show. But early on especially, I don't know if he could have conveyed the layers of this Leo we see in the diary. I would have loved to see him try.
I would have liked to see him more with Jacques Renault because that's the important part. Every other person Leo has, he has some form of need of power or antagonism to him, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's people he's working with, whether or not it's people that may betray him. But someone like Jacques Renault, someone like Ronette Pulaski, someone like Laura Palmer, I think that he can be the most himself, the most calm. And that is something that we get because we are actually in Leo's house at this point. Well, Leo's mental house. We've been to Leo's house. Nothing has really gone that well.
And Bobby is the one who introduces Laura to Leo, which, of course, is another unfortunate cause and effect situation.
Or unfortunate souls.
And he warns Laura that Leo's into some real stuff. Like, we don't want to mess with him.
Yeah.
And
what do we
that
do?
Intrigues Laura.
Yeah.
It does not put her away from that.
Nope.
And Leo's the one to first introduce Laura to cocaine. So again, Leo having that sort of effect on her. Leo is hosting these sex parties. There's one in particular that's described where Laura goes there and there's this woman that everyone's attention is on, and she's making this bet, I think it was like $100, that no one could satisfy her. And Laura, in front of everyone, including Leo and including Bobby, and almost reveling in the fact that it's in front of Bobby, she steps forward and takes that bet. And long story short, uncomfortable subject matter going quickly, we get to the stance that Laura is dominant in that situation, very affectionate, very much calling the woman beautiful, very much trying to please her, and ends up winning that bet. Suffice it to say. Again, we don't have her directly write Bobby or Bobby's reaction, but we get the sense that Bobby might be like pretending to be into it, but probably deeply hurt. And Leo probably legitimately into it, and probably no contradictions there. That's the sort of thing that intrigues Leo more in Laura, that she's someone that has that party aesthetic in her.
It is something that he can definitely relate to because he is someone who is very involved with these vices. So, that was a stepping stone in a certain direction.
And I feel like we only really know the tip of the iceberg, considering that whole list of names. We know that there are all these encounters with Leo's parties that are probably half the list is probably because of Leo indirectly or directly. And, or that or One-Eyed Jacques. And Laura's, they have these range of activities that happen where she's blindfolded and it's not really clear like how many people she was with that she never even found out who they were after the fact. And she said that, and this is what's, again, concerning and also very enlightening about the nature of this book. Again, released in like 1990. It's crazy. This is a spin-off for a TV show on CBS that aired opposite of Cheers. And it was released in 1990, but she says that these parties had access to all sexual fantasies except farm animals. The fact that she even has to mention that wasn't on the table tells you pretty much everything else was. Nothing, it's not new, right? Even in the 90s, there was this sense of all those niches and fetishes were all on the table at those parties.
Oh, yeah. There's drugs, there's underage individuals, there's likely alcohol involved, there's just like all sorts of I'm sure Caligula would have blushed at some of the stuff. And
there's also this sort of, again, flip of the coin here where although it is dangerous that these people who are often friends with Leo could very much do her harm, there's obviously the risk of the safe sex isn't happening. There's the risk of STDs. There's obvious risks. She is a minor. But in all of this darkness, there is that silver lining where this is a joy to her. This is something that she turns to because in these moments where people are physically close, she identifies it as almost the sort of need to be held that everyone has. And this was a moment where all those roles of gender, of age, of background fall aside to just this moment of pure physicality. Again, very dangerous, very wrong, very questionable. But I think it does a disservice to the book to not acknowledge the fact that she turned to it as what she saw as a positive. There were costs, but it was a net benefit because it gave her enough of a joy. And I would say distraction, but I think it's more than a distraction. She genuinely sought after that sort of welcoming feeling.
She sought after these feelings that I would imagine she would think that she'd be able to overcome her own personal problems, which I think may have just been an effect of some of the stimulants she was taking. that this was important to overcome her personal darknesses.
Yeah. And there's a moment where Laura writes that she and Leo are cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
And she says that at this point, later on, she sleeps with Leo more than she sleeps with Bobby. And Bobby sleeps with Shelley probably more than she sleeps with Laura. And he sleeps with Laura.
Yep.
You get the idea.
I get the idea. It's a horrifying idea, but I get the idea.
And it makes me wonder how much Shelley ever found out about Bobby. Like, how much was Bobby able to lean into Shelley to share these pains? I would almost wager nothing. At the point of this show, I feel like Bobby was taught a lesson that when he opens up emotionally to a girl he's in love with, he will get laughed at. And I really don't know if he ever felt comfortable with Shelley to tell her the sort of things that we know from this diary.
I think that when it comes to season 2, and when he just sits down and tries to be at the level with Shelley, that was his own emotional breakthrough. I think that was the very next time
it's
he
an
was willing
improvement.
to be
It's a
open.
next step. I don't think he ever fully got there again. I think he's recovering.
Yes.
But I don't think he ever sat down with Shelley in the course of season 1 or season 2 and told her about these sort of pains.
No, but
I don't know. I mean, I know Shelley knows that Bobby was involved with Leo to some extent. She knows his habits with drugs. I don't know if Shelley ever did cocaine. We know Shelley drinks and Shelley smokes, but that's the extent of it.
I think there might be a level with it because the way that he may have seen Laura with Leo and then seeing him potentially losing Shelley to someone like Gordon Cole, that's when something might have snapped inside of him.
But does Shelley know that he killed a man?
Who knows? Maybe that's what they're laughing about at the end.
Maybe as they grab each other's faces and bark.
I don't know what other reaction you would have when you killed a man.
That's fair enough. What are your overall thoughts then on Leo in the diary?
My overall thoughts on Leo is that I am very glad that I got an alternate perspective on this man who is just mainly aggression personified because he's in his natural environment in this. Not to mention, I'd say that he's far more loving to Laura than he would ever have been shown to be loving to Shelley. Shelley might have seen something inside of Leo and connected, but it might have been in the same way that Bobby was to Laura, and the difference was in the point where I said I loved you, like Leo was the one to let that continue and may have like leaned into that. And maybe he did feel something more than Laura. But that's cut from the same cloth,
right.
Whether it is fully real or if it's just a swayed perspective of Laura. I think it's close enough to say that there's a reason why Leo and Shelley are together.
It's very hard because we don't really have the objective distance. We have Laura's perspective. How much was that tainted and colored, and how much did her expectations of people get swayed? There's a moment where Leo hit her harder than she expected, and it was a moment of vulnerability to her. And it wasn't Leo that noticed at first, but when Leo was notified, it seems like he responded with care. The one who seems to be a little more attentive to Laura's state is Jacques.
Yeah.
Jacques gets a lot of characterization too here. There's a point when she's involved with Leo that she notices that she feels a sense of belonging when she's in dark places with sleazy men who are actually babies.
Yeah.
And she describes that sort of feeling of the men who are bigger, but almost acting like that baby type personality, crying to her, calling her mommy. And she identifies Jacques as being one of those types. That Jacques is that big man, big baby type. But she also describes Jacques as someone who knows how to please a woman and knows how to please a woman's body more than Leo. And I think what seems to be implied about Jacques here is that more than anything else, her relationship with Jacques is one of tenderness where he seems entirely devoted to making her feel good. And again, it's disgusting morally because, again, how old is he versus how old is she?
Yep.
But from her perspective, Jacques never hurt her.
Now, mind
Not
you,
from her perspective.
Yeah, there is something said about Jacques in which he really knows how to please a woman, so there seems to be a form of intimacy found with him. One thing I'd like to make note is that inside the list of Laura Palmer's experiences, I can't recall if the list came before or after the experiences. I'm pretty sure it came after.
Yeah.
Was that Jacques Renault, like JR, is not found inside of it. It is a wonder because Jacques Renault is noted inside the book and noted as Jacques Renault. But I wonder if they're either A, there wasn't enough intimacy or that she would account him for the book. If it was an oversight from the author in which JR was not added to it. Or C, the Renault family is a little bit notorious for criminal activity. Maybe like Jacques Renault isn't his actual name. Maybe it's just something that he kind of goes under, and Laura knows something a little bit more about this guy that we don't know. I mean, Jean Renault is known as Jean Renault, and I don't know about you, but whenever it comes to crime families or people who commit crimes, they don't really like to advertise their true names.
The hard part, Professor, is that I can't reveal anything that has like, I can't say if it's going to be proven or disproven or anything like that.
Gotcha. I can't wait until the episode of The Return of Twin Peaks in which we get him flashing his ID at every single character.
I don't know.
When he's dead.
I don't know how you want me to respond to this.
From the grave.
If I respond clearly with a positive or negative on your third guess, is that a spoiler?
Maybe, maybe not. I don't know whether or not I would necessarily need the answer. It's just personal, like, insights on my end.
I feel like I need to say there is no other name given to him in the Twin Peaks wiki article on him. There is no other name, and when it lists the family, they're all given Renault as the last name.
Now, is it just those few Renaults, or is there more Renaults of note?
There are more Renaults.
Okay.
It does appear to be the actual name of a family.
I'm curious if, like,
there's no other material that gives another name. So if it is the case,
yeah,
it's consistently Renault throughout everything else.
Yeah.
And this would be the only indication we would have.
Yes.
If it's enough, you think, to make that case, then make that case. That case is fair to make.
Okay.
But there's nothing that's going to substantiate that more later, is all I'm going to say.
Okay.
And I don't like to give spoilers.
I didn't expect it from a dead man, personally.
Yeah, I don't want to give spoilers, but I do feel like I need to give an opinion on that side.
That's
because
fine.
The idea that it's an oversight is startling, considering that Jacques Renault is such an obvious person who slept with Laura Palmer. And the idea that they didn't go that far is also bizarre, considering the way that she writes about him.
Bite the bullet, baby.
So I'm inclined to believe it's an oversight.
Okay.
But it's a hard to believe oversight.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way she describes how he pleases women, I think it'd be weird if she wasn't on the receiving end of that.
Yeah.
The only way I can imagine is if she didn't let him, but there was never any indication in the diary that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
He was clearly into her. I mean, there was a moment where he gave this present in the bra to her and had drugs and had a wand in there.
Yes.
And again, things to make Laura feel good.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine he hadn't had that involvement with her.
Mm-hmm. The only initials that do have R at the end are MR, Mr., or MSR.
Yeah, I don't...
Meanwhile, the ones that have J at the beginning are JH, JH, JS, which is the closest letter to R.
Yeah.
And that is about it. So,
legitimately, if you have any thoughts, listener, on what's going on here, there is a page. What's the page in your copy there? In my copy, I should say.
In your copy. In the copy of the latest paperback issue is on page 132.
What date is this?
February 1st, 1988.
So if anyone has any guesses as to why JR or J, another initial R for like a middle name, why that's not in there, please let us know.
And tell me how I'm right.
Tell us how we're both wrong and tell us the truth. Very, very curious on that. Either way, we get the sense that Jacques is very sweet on Laura. And again, he was the one that noticed Leo slapping that Laura wasn't into that Laura was hurt.
Yes.
He's the one that has them stop.
Yes.
And again, I don't want to romanticize Jacques. He's a predator. Like, at the end of the day, he gets involved with Laura when she's like 14 at the oldest, right? Like maybe 15.
14, 15, 16. All these numbers are bad.
Yes. So no matter what we're saying here, just to be completely clear for any listener.
She's a susceptible individual that has gone through so many drugs, alcohol, has been in poor situations with poor crowds, and has emotional issues that have not really been handled in any good light.
Yeah. So Jacques is only, quote unquote, nice in the extent that he seems to be a figure that makes her feel good in her life, and to her, he's someone safe to go back to.
He is nice in the respects of this dark, dark world that she sits in. Yeah. It's something that she can relate with in the overall activities and placements that there are. There's still areas in which, like, consent is obviously definitely questionable, being that, you know, she is a minor. Mm-hmm. But it's enough of a agreed upon term for Laura Palmer that seems to be giving Jacques a lighter light than what others may give him.
There's an incredible section of the book where Laura's in more danger than she's ever felt with Bob before, where she has these men who are threatening her, basically, and she had been hitchhiking.
Yes.
And they pick her up, and I'm not going to summarize the whole story, but again, if you haven't read the diary or haven't read it in a while, this is, in my opinion, one of the highlights of the book.
Okay.
And it shows the extent to which Laura's found herself in danger and how she's able to get through this danger. And it's one of those moments where I do think it's calling out the predatory nature of a lot of these men, where there's a moment where basically they imply that she should have known better than to try to get away with hitchhiking when she was wearing those clothes. It's the typical line of it's what she was wearing. She was asking for it. It's in there. And they describe it that she's like poured into her clothes. It's very creepy, very, very dangerous language.
Yep.
And these men she describes as being big enough that they could swallow her. She is able to lure them away. She's able to get one of them away to the truck on pretenses of sex, knock him out with a beer bottle. We don't even know that guy's dead because he's bleeding when she leaves.
Yeah, everyone else was like fully asleep just because of how much her constitution allowed her, despite her scenario.
It is the scariest night of her life up to that point. She describes it as being scarier than Bob, and she goes to Jacques' cabin. She goes to Jacques for help.
Yep.
And again, I think that adds an element of tragedy, that knowing that she is killed with Jacques and Leo in attendance like that night. Like, Jacques and Leo are at the scene of this whole situation.
She was like, that's where her comfort was.
She was not safe there.
No.
She was safe that one time, as safe as you can argue that was, but she was running out of safe places.
Mm-hmm. And it is definitely questionable on, like, we do understand that Leland Palmer was the killer at the end of the day. How did that necessarily progress? Was it that maybe Jacques' cabin was more safe for her during the time, but when Leland caught up to her, let's just face it, it's her dad. Mm-hmm. Her dad could have caught up to her at any point.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if I even give too much credence on that not being your safe place. It's just saddening that it was.
I just think seeing these viewpoints on Jacques and Leo is so revealing, not only to their characters, but also Laura's character relationships with them.
Yes.
And also the nature of the town and the nature of the motivations of these people. Mm-hmm. The last one kind of in that main trio we get is Ronette.
Yes.
And I almost wish there'd been more Ronette content in the book.
You always wish for more Ronette content.
I know, because I think she's an interesting character that doesn't get a lot of time in the light.
Yes.
That being said, I think what we're given it paints a pretty strong picture that she was almost the second Donna figure, the inverse shadow Donna, right? If we're going to use our reflection idea. That she even, from the beginning, compares her there. In the diary, she says, Ronette was the only girl aside from Donna at the time she would see naked. And Laura knew Ronette from before. She liked her. And enough that she liked her that Ronette might have been the origin points of Laura's first sense of sexual curiosity toward women.
Yep.
If not the first, one of the first. So having this figure that was tied largely in her mind to her interest in women, and then having Ronette reciprocate.
Yes.
Having Ronette, someone of a similar age, maybe a little older, it's unclear, being kind of understanding and being on her side of those things, compared to, again, someone like Donna who would giggle or would be uncomfortable with anything even remotely close to what the things that she and Ronette would talk about.
Yeah.
And it's when she goes after the hitchhikers I talked about, when Laura goes back to Jacques' cabin, it's Ronette who's the most supportive at Jacques' cabin. Ronette's the one who writes to her the next day after when Laura is probably passed out from all of the things that had happened. It's Ronette who writes and follows up to make sure that Laura got help and that Laura was okay. They form what seems to be a genuine friendship under these circumstances. But Ronette, we don't really know her backstory. We don't know how she got where she is. Yeah. We know the end result. We know that she was on drugs. We know that she'd been using drugs, I should say.
Yes.
We know that she was also as sexually active as Laura, and again, likely a minor.
Yes.
By the way things are worded. But we don't know what Ronette's trauma is or baggage. We don't know where Ronette comes from. I think that is an interesting element. Laura, while is a victim in the shadows, we at least from the diary perspective know who she is.
Yes.
Even at the end of this with Ronette, we still don't know what she went through.
We don't know what she went through. We've seen her parents, but not so much the interactions, and there's not much to be revealed. Now, mind you, that might just be the general nature of the relationship with Ronette, Leo, Jacques, and Laura, in which nothing really needed to be known about their past. It's all about the present and the feeling of then and what they got from each other at those times. Again, probably the most supportive people towards Laura, but I don't think that was the type of support that she needed at the time.
And Laura even notes that when she tries to go sober for a bit, it's hard for her to talk to Ronette when she's sober.
Yeah, because it's that disconnect, and that's troubling.
Right. Laura, again, to use Twin Peaks phrases, she's between two worlds, right? She's caught between these two different lives that she lives, these two different worlds that she lives in, and the more she gives into one, the more the other one calls her back. And somewhere lurking on the threshold is Bob, continuously pushing and pulling her. And we get information on the perfume counter. We get information that she likes working with Ronette. She thinks Ronette's really cool. And it's through this perfume counter situation that she gets involved with Emery Battis, or if you're reading the diary, Amory Battis.
Yep.
And not really a lot of flattering words for him. She describes him as a fruit that is slowly rotting. She describes him as a constant pest.
There are not many flattering ways to put Amory Battis. Now, mind you, might not be the opinion of the town.
He's the shadow Tim Pinkle.
He's the shadow Tim Pinkle. Sure.
I don't know what that means.
I will say right now, for all those Amory Battis fans out there, look forward yet again to Welcome to Twin Peaks. I need to say something about Amory Battis.
You've been peeking through that book.
I've been peeking through that, and
Bob.
No, not Bob. No, I refuse to call his name.
Beware of Bob. Bob. I'm doing a robot with my hands right now. I'm not sure why.
I don't know either. Apparently,
we've been podcasting for too long.
Never.
And thus, the red curtain closes. But this isn't the end of our adventure, listeners. We still have a fair amount of the book to go, and so we are going to be splitting this episode into 2 parts. So please, join us on our next time of scheduled programming, or on just the very next episode if you are from the future, as we continue to go deeper into Laura's diary.